Madam Speaker, by direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 470 and ask for its immediate consideration.
And the clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 82, House Resolution 470, resolved that at any time after adoption of this resolution, the Speaker may, pursuant to Clause 2B of Rule 18, declare the House resolved into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of the bill, H.R. 3590, to protect and enhance opportunities for recreational hunting, fishing, and shooting, and for other purposes. The first reading of the bill shall be dispensed with. All points of order against consideration of the bill are waived. General debate shall be confined to the bill and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Natural Resources. After general debate, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. The bill shall be considered as read. All points of order against provisions in the bill are waived. No amendment to the bill shall be in order except those printed in the report of the Committee on Rules accompanying this resolution. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question in the House or in the Committee of the Whole. All points of order against such amendments are waived. At the conclusion of consideration of the bill for amendment, the committee shall rise and report the bill to the House with such amendments as may have been adopted. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the bill and amendments thereto to final passage without intervening motion except one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
Gentleman from Texas, recognized for 1 hour.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. For the purpose of the debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentleman from Worcester, Massachusetts, my friend, Mr. McGovern, pending which I yield such time as I may consume. During consideration of this resolution, all times yielded for the purpose of debate only.
Without objection.
Madam Speaker, I want to apologize for being 2 minutes late to come here, and I apologize to not only you but also the staff and my friends from the Rules Committee for being late. Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
House Resolution 470 provides for a structured rule for consideration of H.R. 3590. This rule makes in order 11 amendments which provide for discussion and opportunities for members of the minority and the majority to participate in this debate. Yesterday in the Rules Committee, we held what I consider to be an open discussion about this bill where amendments were fully discussed and debated, and I'm pleased to say that there will be these 11 amendments as a result of the action by the Rules Committee. Madam Speaker, the bill before us today represents a year-long, bipartisan, bicameral legislative process to protect our public lands and to preserve traditional hunting, fishing, and recreational shooting for American sportsmen and sportswomen. Specifically, H.R. 3590 improves access to federal lands for hunting and fishing. It protects Second Amendment rights enshrined by the Constitution of the United States and promotes sportsmen's views, giving them a seat at a table through an innovative advisory committee to collaborate with the Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture on ways to better serve and conserve wildlife, habitat, and traditional outdoor activities. American sportsmen are some of the strongest stewards of our nation's unparalleled natural resources. We have an abundance of natural resources, but they all must be in a protected and stewardship role, and that is what the American hunter does for this country. They direct conservation projects. They establish nonprofit organizations to protect wildlife and precious habitat. And sportsmen are leading advocates to ensure that we leave a stronger, more vibrant America for future generations. And I might add that we teach our children and the next generation the same, so that the legacy that we leave is prepared for our future. Additionally, according to the 2011 National Survey of Fishing, Hunting, and Wildlife Associated Recreation, American sportsmen contribute roughly $90 billion in economic activity every year. These resources sustain thousands of American jobs and protect our nation's rich outdoor heritage. They also provide many of our rural areas of this country with needed jobs for people who live in rural areas who care very much about conservation and of their local areas to keep them natural. Unfortunately, all too often the federal government erects unnecessary barriers which prevent Americans from participating in many activities also that should be available on federal lands. That is why H.R. 3590 is important. It streamlines government regulations to allow for greater access to our nation's public lands so that all Americans can enjoy everything that our great out of doors have to offer. As a sportsman myself, I will tell you that I have enjoyed our national parks, I've enjoyed state parks, I've enjoyed the out of doors, and in particular as a young Boy Scout growing up all the way through being an Eagle Scout and an adult leader, that I have utilized these resources, which has allowed me to gain not only an opportunity to know more about America, but to be able to pass it on to my sons and others. It is a great way to spend an afternoon or a weekend or a week with your family, the out of doors, and learning more about America. Today I want to thank the Natural Resources Committee Chairman, Doc Hastings, who is from Washington. He understands the West and he understands the out of doors. His leadership on this issue was essential, as well as the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus co-chairman, Bob Latta from Ohio and Benny Thompson from Mississippi. Both of these men met with me and the committee early on to make sure that we would be prepared for their bills that would come to the floor as a package, with the understanding that on a bicameral, bipartisan basis, we would move this legislation. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the rule and yes on the underlying legislation. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I want to thank the Chairman of the Rules Committee, Mr. Sessions, for yielding me the customary 30 minutes. And I rise today in opposition to the rule and the underlying bill, and I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Recognized.
Madam Speaker, this bill is a solution in search of a problem. It's an omnibus bill that has been cobbled together in a back room by the Republican leadership. While the Resources Committee has considered some of these bills, not every bill made it through the committee process. In fact, two of the measures in this bill were never reported out of committee, and no committee considered this omnibus bill. So much for regular order. Madam Speaker, we have a number of major time-sensitive issues that we should be tackling here in this Congress. We should be extending unemployment benefits for the 1.6 million Americans whose benefits expired on December 28th, and the 72,000 more who lose them each week we fail to act. We should be raising the minimum wage to help the too many Americans who work two jobs and still struggle to make ends meet. We should be finding common ground on comprehensive immigration reform to finally fix our broken immigration system. And we should be bringing to the floor a clean bill to raise the debt ceiling, which yesterday Treasury Secretary Lew said we'll hit by the end of the month. Defaulting on our national debt risks another downgrade of our credit rating. But we are not considering any of those items today. Instead, we have before us another cobbled together lands bill that goes much further than just expanding hunting and fishing opportunities on public lands. It undermines a number of common sense, long-standing environmental laws that protect the beautiful lands that outdoor enthusiasts love. And it's loaded up with an array of unrelated provisions, like making it easier to import polar bear trophies. Madam Speaker, let me remind my colleagues that 75% of all federal lands are open to recreational hunting, fishing, and shooting. There are ample opportunities for hunters and fishermen to pursue these recreational activities. And H.R. 3590 effectively overrides several important common sense conservation laws and elevates hunting and shooting ahead of all other legitimate uses of land. And it does so without including several important bipartisan reauthorizations sought by outdoor sportsmen and women and conservation groups. Not only is the underlying bill bad policy, the process bringing this bill up is lousy. Despite the fact that this omnibus bill wasn't considered by any committee, the Rules Committee decided to close down the amendment process. The truth is that this rule makes in order every single Republican amendment while only making in order 1/3 of the Democratic amendments. So much for openness and so much for fairness, Madam Speaker. I am particularly disappointed that last night the Rules Committee failed to make in order an amendment that I was proud to offer with Mr. Holt of New Jersey and several other of my colleagues that would have reauthorized the Land and Water Conservation Fund. The Land and Water Conservation Fund program uses royalties from oil and gas drilling to protect and preserve access to federal and state lands. The stateside program has been especially important to the creation of parks and recreational facilities in my home state of Massachusetts. The Holt Amendment reauthorizing LWCF is critical. This program will expire soon, and it needs to be reauthorized. The Holt Amendment is germane and does not require any waivers, yet the Republican leadership blocked it along with 2/3 of the other amendments offered by the Democrats. Madam Speaker, H.R. 3590 is a bill in search of a problem. We saw a similar package last year that went nowhere in the Senate, and I expect a similar fate for this year's version because gutting environmental laws is a non-starter for so many members. Madam Speaker, we should be focusing our time on the real challenges facing our economy. We should be extending unemployment insurance. It is unconscionable that we are just sitting here doing things like this, things that are going nowhere, while so many of our fellow Americans have lost their unemployment benefits. What are they to do? What are they to do? These are people looking for jobs and can't find them. We should be raising the minimum wage. We should be giving the American people a raise. My friends on the other side of the aisle complain about all these government social programs. Well, the fact is that in the United States of America, you can work full-time and still earn so little that you will require things like food stamps and other government subsidies. We should stop subsidizing places like McDonald's and Walmart who don't pay their workers a livable wage. We should raise the minimum wage. And you work in this country and you work full-time, you ought not to have to live in poverty. And we should fix our broken immigration system. And we should also pass a clean extension of the debt ceiling so that we don't ruin this economy. These are the things we should be talking about. These are the things we should be debating. Those are the priorities facing our country. And we're doing nothing. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on this rule and on the underlying bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves his time. Gentleman from Texas.
Madam Speaker, thank you very much, and I appreciate the gentleman from Massachusetts in not only his arguments, many of which were made in the Rules Committee last night as we properly went through, I believe rather meticulously, in answers to what the gentleman brought up. It is important to note that 3 Democrat amendments were withdrawn, 1 Democrat amendment was non-germane, and several other Democrat amendments, I think we effectively said they will be tackled either in another piece of legislation or because they are a larger bill that needs to be heard by the committee, updated, and in fact, the land bill is set to be done next year in 2015 with its expiration. The chairman of the committee, the gentleman Doc Hastings, very meticulously covered his thoughts and ideas about that and told the Rules Committee that, in fact, that he did believe that it would need to be updated on a bipartisan basis. Doc Hastings, as the chairman, also stated that the majority of his bills, that he had brought to the committee, at least under his chairmanship, were done on a bipartisan basis, where there was an agreement within the committee to move bills. While there may be disagreements about all piece parts of the legislation, that they garnered respect from each other out of their committee. And it was not the Republican leadership. In fact, it was the Rules Committee that made the decision based upon testimony that they heard upstairs listening to the committee chairman, understanding the committee's thoughts and ideas, and then moving appropriately. The gentleman from Massachusetts does make other points about job bills, and I would point to a Congressional Budget Office nonpartisan CBO report that came out today that talks about the effects of a new update about the Affordable Care Act, which is known as President Obama alluded to here, Obamacare. The word Obamacare, when used in that context, will push the equivalent of about 2 million American workers out of the labor market by 2017, as employees decide either to work fewer hours or to drop out altogether, according to the latest estimates from the Congressional Budget Office. And they said that there's a major jump in the nonpartisan agency's projection, and it suggests that the health care law's initiatives and the incentives in it are driving business and people to choose government-sponsored benefits rather than work. Quote, the CBO estimates that the ACA, Affordable Care Act, will reduce the total number of hours worked on by net by about 1.5 to 2% during the period from 2017 to 2014, almost entirely because workers will choose to supply less labor given new taxes and other incentives that they will face from the financial benefits that some will receive. CBO analysts wrote this in their new economic outlook. They further stated that the rollout problems with the Affordable Care Act, known as the ACA, last year will mean that only some estimated 6 million people will sign up through the state-based exchanges rather than the 7 million that the CBO had originally said would sign up. What this means is that the laws that were passed as a result of President Obama, Nancy Pelosi being Speaker of the House, and Harry Reid as being the Senate Majority Leader, they passed laws which are substantially reducing the number of people who actually work in America. There were a net some 230,000 people that lost their job this last month. The Affordable Care Act continues to be the number one reason why American businesses and small business employers do not hire more workers in this country. The gentleman is correct that the Democrat leadership, as well as ranking members from the Ways and Means Committee and the Budget Committee, have approached the Rules Committee and asked for us to extend by 1.3 million people the number of people who would be extended long-term benefits. I had a discussion with both Sandy Levin of the Ways and Means Committee and Chris Van Hollen, the ranking member at the Budget Committee, and told them that the Republican Party in the House of Representatives has, since the President initiated this action and it was passed in the House, that we saw where there would be millions of people who would lose their jobs, that we would have unemployment at the numbers that we have, and that there's not one unintended consequence in this. These were well known, they were well understood, they were simply ignored by Democrats and the media as a possible probable outcome. So I told both these gentlemen when they came to the Rules Committee that I would be very pleased to engage with them on a private basis as a member of Congress, them as a member of Congress, on a way that we could add 1.3 million jobs if we were going to extend the unemployment compensation. I believe it is immoral for this country to have as a policy extending long-term unemployments to people rather than us working on creation of jobs. A job is the most important attribute, I believe, in a free enterprise system of a person, a family circumstance, for a husband, a wife, children when they're able at the appropriate age, to be able to have a job, to learn to take care of themselves, to be able to meet their needs, to be able to become engaged in their community and have self-respect enough to know that jobs are important. And I think too much time we have been hung up on, instead of the creation of jobs, we talk about the symptoms that are related to unemployment and long-term unemployment. In this case, the President of the United States thoughtfully articulates the need for us to make sure we help people, but I believe he errs on the side of not pushing jobs bills, coming to the table as the President, as he said he would when he was a candidate, as he should as President, of working with Republicans and Democrats on well-understood ways that you create more jobs. But the President has chosen not to do this. It continues to be a 5-year pattern. I would note that when we had many of these same issues or similar, when President Clinton was in office, he worked with Republicans, and granted, they were Republican ideas. Balance the budget, welfare reform, cutting taxes, reducing rules and regulations. And I do admit that is a complete Republican agenda. But we saw where one Democrat president joined with Republicans to work for a great opportunity for us to grow our economy, to face down other nations who were willing to not only grow their economies at our expense, but to add American workers and a brighter future for all Americans. The Republican Party, House leadership, Speaker John Boehner, Majority Leader Eric Cantor, have repeatedly stood at this podium for 5 years, and we have a constant theme, and that is, let's work together. Not on raising taxes, not on more rules and regulations, not on job-killing health care ideas, but rather initiatives that the private sector, CEOs, small business leaders say will help them to understand better the things that they need to go employ Americans. Instead, the Democrat majority chose to do a bill, the Affordable Care Act, that at that time more than 55% of Americans opposed. We were told, wait till you learn about it, you're going to love this. Not just read it to learn what's in it, but the longer that you have it out there, it's going to be a real attribute. Well, let me tell you what. We're going to find out this October when instead of 8 million Americans are going to lose their health care and have to make decisions, there are going to be 80 million people. And it will be at that time, perhaps slightly before, when the American people will understand it was one party, one group of people, they are called the Republicans, who tried to warn us, who tried to hold some 47 individual votes on individual pieces of the Affordable Care Act that ruin employment, that make taxes even higher, and move jobs overseas. And this is why the Republican Party is here today moving this bill. We will be with a water bill tomorrow on the floor, and we will continue down the pathway of showing the differences of what we are for. We're for the American worker. We're for growing jobs. We believe GDP is an embarrassment, and we believe that unemployment is immoral, and we should add jobs. So I'm going to join my colleague Sandy Levin, my colleague Chris Van Hollen, and we're going to see if we can craft something that we would have on this floor, but it's got to net add over 1 million jobs, because that is what America needs, a real answer, not rhetoric. I reserve my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves his time. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, first of all, let me just say to my colleague from Texas, I think the Republican Party, and especially the Republican leadership in this House, should be ashamed of the obstructionism that has gone on to block every major initiative that this president has put forward to try to create jobs. And I think they should be ashamed of their indifference toward working families in this country. My colleague talks about the Affordable Care Act. Millions and millions of people now have health insurance who before did not have it. That's just a fact. You may not like it, but it's a fact. being a woman is no longer considered a pre-existing condition with regard to health care. That's a fact. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. I would like to think my Republican colleagues would cheer that. Millions of young people can stay on their parents' insurance while they're looking for a job, so they have the security of health care. That's a good thing. You know, I mean, and CBO continues to say that the Affordable Care Act will reduce our deficit. And repealing it, as my Republican friends want to do, will increase the deficit. That's nuts. I repeat, what we should be talking about on this floor is extending unemployment insurance for those who have lost it. 1.6 million people lost it on December 28th. 73,000 people have lost it each additional week that has passed. The fact that we don't have the sense of urgency to do something about that is shameful. That's what we should be talking about. My colleagues say we should have a pay-for. You know, notwithstanding the fact that George Bush extended long-term unemployment benefits on a number of occasions and they never asked for a pay-for. But my colleague from Maryland, Mr. Van Hollen, came up to the Rules Committee with the pay-for, saying we would pay for it with the savings from the Farm Bill. My friend said, well, that's not enough. I don't know what is enough. How long does this indifference have to continue? We need to do immigration reform. We need to raise the minimum wage so that when you work in this country, you don't live in poverty. And with regard to the Land and Water Conservation Fund, we want to extend it for 5 years, not a year at a time. We want to give communities an opportunity to plan. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. And my friends have blocked that. My friends have blocked that. It was germane, and my Republican friends said, no, you can't have a debate and a vote on it on the House floor. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to urge that we defeat the previous question. And I will, and if we defeat the previous question, I will offer an amendment to the rule to bring up H.R. 3370, the bipartisan House companion to the flood insurance premium increase relief bill that the Senate has already passed. To discuss and I want to say to my guy, that's another issue. That's an issue we should be talking about now. That's more important than this bill that's before us, that's going nowhere. And to discuss the urgency of passing flood insurance relief, I yield 2 minutes to Ms. Castor of Florida.
Gentlelady from Florida, recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I'd like to thank my colleague from Massachusetts for yielding the time. And also urge all of my colleagues to vote no on the rule in the previous question so that we can take up and vote on the Senate-passed bill from last week that would provide some relief to families and businesses across America from these unconscionable increases in flood insurance rates. It would also give us time to work on a bipartisan solution. Madam Speaker, for the past few months, I have offered on every single piece of legislation moving through the Rules Committee to this floor an amendment that would provide some relief to families and businesses across America on the flood insurance relief. Here's why it's important. We're dealing with the unintended consequences of a bill the Congress passed in 2012 that people were not aware of. It was going to really suck our neighbors with these high flood insurance increases. FEMA did not follow through on their responsibilities, so the best course of action now is to pause. And kudos to the Senate that passed last week by a broad bipartisan vote. 67 bipartisan members in the Senate passed a flood bill with the input of realtors, families, businesses, chambers from all across the country. It's vital that the House take up this bill right away. Let me give you a few examples from back home in the Tampa Bay area. Paul Page lives in Ruskin, Florida. He says, my name is Paul Page. I'm a retired 30% disabled veteran living in Ruskin, Florida. I need your help now. I purchased my home in December of 2012. My flood insurance was $1,400 per year. But thanks to the Bigger Waters Act of 2012, my flood insurance is rising to $5,400 per year. Please help me now. Or James Smith in Tampa, in South Tampa, owns property. His premium will go from $2,000 per year to $9,000 per year. Or Frank and Shirley Davis in Shore Acres in St. Petersburg. They just listed their home for $175,000, but they're going to have an new annual premium of $4,000 that has now negated any chance they have of selling their home. This is happening all across the country. And Madam Speaker, this Republican majority people have called it the do-nothing Congress. They are very skeptical that the Republican-controlled Congress can respond to middle-class families and provide economic relief where it was needed. Well, here's a chance for the Republican majority to step up and address a very severe economic issue for families and businesses all across this country. The longer the Republican leadership puts this off, the greater economic harm it will cause to families and businesses across America. Vote no on the previous question and the rule.
Gentlelady's time's expired. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I have great respect for the gentlewoman from Florida and would like to affirm that she has come to the Rules Committee, and it is the Rules Committee that has been pondering these questions and will continue to. The Rules Committee, as of several weeks ago, attempted to work with, on a bipartisan basis, through the Financial Services Committee, and there were not agreements that were done there on a bipartisan basis. So I think the Committee of Jurisdiction needs an opportunity to be able to faithfully look at it and come up with an answer. I think a backstop would be, as it's done, simply to delay things 4 years because of this government's inability to effectively do what they were tasked with doing. But notwithstanding, I very much appreciate the gentlewoman and her constant comments, not just to me, but also to members of the Rules Committee, to understand that we do have to come up with an answer on this. I wish today were that answer. We'll continue to work at it, and I appreciate the gentlewoman very much for her continued insistence with me. And I have also told one of my colleagues, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, as well as members of the Rules Committee that are on the Republican side, that we'll continue to work on this, and I expect us to be successful. I reserve my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I think the Rules Committee ought to stop pondering and maybe start acting. And with that, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating.
2 minutes from the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I heard the gentleman from Texas say, and I appreciate his intensity, that he believes there's a flawed insurance policy that's government-sponsored. And if that's the case, then it should be delayed. And he was willing to shut down government to do it. I want to talk about something that's a flawed government insurance plan that's scientifically proven to be wrong. No debate about it. And that should be delayed, too. I have a family in my hometown in Bourne, Massachusetts, just bought a house. They bought that house for $240,000. They had a $400 bill, the predecessors did, for flood insurance. They were shocked, and I was shocked. That bill is now increased to $44,000 a year. $44,000 a year. If you take away the value of their home, in about 2 or 3 years of payments for flood insurance at that rate, it's the whole value of their home. Now, I want to also tell you that it's a government taking, in effect, I think, to have this policy in effect. Because if they go to sell that home, and someone has to get a mortgage, as most people do, to buy it, the value of that home is going to be diminished. Someone's probably going to have to pay cash and maybe pay $100,000 for a $240,000 home. That's government reaching in, taking the value of their nest egg, of all their life savings, of the place they live, away from them. Now, I said it's scientifically proven. I want to show you. I went to the University of Massachusetts in Dartmouth. Their coastal study experts there, scientists, engineers, said what FEMA did in establishing the maps where these rates are based upon are flawed. In fact, they used the Pacific Ocean methodology on the Atlantic Ocean. That's how fundamental the flaws are. Now, my county in Plymouth that I represent, by taking this through the appeals process and bringing in this study that I was able to obtain from UMass, they took the whole county of Plymouth in Massachusetts. I asked the gentleman for another 30 seconds if he'd be willing to yield that.
I yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman's yielded an additional 30 seconds.
That whole county now has this insurance plan delayed. It shouldn't just be my county in Plymouth that's delayed. And FEMA can't do this throughout the whole, there's not enough time throughout the whole country. but it should be not just my county. It should be all of Massachusetts. It should be the Northeast. It should be all the coastal areas, all the river areas in this country. They should be treated with fairness. All we need on this is a vote. There are now 182 co-sponsors, about a third of them Republicans. Let's get it to the floor. Let's be fair. And when we have scientific evidence about a flawed insurance plan, let's make sure we get a vote on it.
Gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I reserve my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, the ranking member of the Committee on Financial Services, Ms. Waters.
Gentlelady from California for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair and members of Congress, we should not have to even debate this any further. It is outrageous that we have learned what we have learned about the failed implementation of FEMA with the Biggert Waters plan and not do something about it. Let me just say this. I joined with Ms. Biggert, and we tried to reform the National Flood Insurance Program. We went about it in a way that we thought would make it possible for people to be able to afford to pay for the National Flood Insurance Program, and not in a way that would cause them to lose their homes. It passed through this House. It passed through the other House. It went out to FEMA. And what did FEMA do? It did not do what we instructed them to do. First of all, we said have a study on affordability. The second thing we said was look at the way you do mapping and remap it. We encourage them to get good data to be able to do this work. They have failed us, and they have failed the citizens of this country. Not only have they failed the citizens of this country, middle class people in this country, homeowners, are now about to lose their homes. California family who is facing a flood insurance premium increase from $1,700 per year up to $22,000 per year, an increase of over 1,100%. I have traveled around the country. I was down in Louisiana. We have members across the country representing Florida and New York and California, on and on and on. And they're begging this Congress to do something about these unintended consequences. I was a co-author on the bill, on the Biggert Waters bill. I know what we attempted to do. These unintended consequences are just that. It should not be happening this way. This is not a partisan bill. This is a bill that's got support from Democrats and Republicans. You heard the previous speaker talk about 183 members on this bill. The Senate passed it out with flying colors, and now it's on us. What are we going to do? Are we going to allow middle-class families to lose their homes because FEMA has not done its job and has not done it correctly? Are we going to allow these families to be put out of homes that they have lived in for years because now, with these increased premiums, they can't sell them? This is unconscionable. We can do better than this. I could go on and tell you about the families and the letters that we have received. It's time for the House of Representatives to consider this legislation. We must address this problem now, before one more family suffers from increased premiums, depressed home prices, or the inability to buy or sell their home. Bring it to the floor. I have talked with the chairman of our committee. I would like everybody to address concerns to the chairman, get this bill to the floor so that we can help our homeowners and our constituents. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady's time's expired. Gentleman from Texas.
Madam Speaker, thank you very much. In fact, once again, the gentlewoman from Los Angeles, I believe, represents a truth. We need to get this done. And I think the committee last year, as I recall, began a process of re-looking at it, trying to work through this issue. And it is my belief and hope, and I have told members of the committee that I intend to stay after this, but the Financial Services Committee, it does have the jurisdiction, and we're looking for an answer rather quickly. And I will continue to work with the gentlewoman from Los Angeles. I'll continue to work with the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings, Judge Hastings, and I'll continue to work with Mrs. Castor from Tampa on this issue. I know that my dear friend from New York, Congressman Meeks, has spoken with me a number of times about this. So it is my hope that the Financial Services Committee will come with a recommendation, a piece of legislation on a bipartisan basis that we can address this, and we'll wait till that is accomplished. And that is what I have told members of the committee, and that's my hope, and I will continue to be engaged in this. I reserve my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves his time. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, let me just say we don't have to wait for the Financial Services Committee to act. The Rules Committee shares jurisdiction on this bill. We should bring this to the floor now. With that, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks.
Minutes.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Last week I received hundreds of calls and emails from my constituents across the Rockaway Peninsula, Broad Channel, and Jamaica Bay in New York's 5th Congressional District. Most had been struck hard by the devastation of Superstorm Sandy and were eagerly hopeful that relief was finally underway with the Senate passage of the flood insurance relief bill. My constituents then asked, how long will it take and when will the House pass the Senate bill? Why is the House not taking up the Senate bill, or why is it being delayed? When will the House leadership, let's put politics aside, because if there's ever an issue that should not involve politics, it is this issue. Because this storm struck Democrats and Republicans. It struck everybody, rich and poor. Everybody was affected by it. So when will we put those differences aside so that we can get something done? Why, they asked, Madam Speaker. It is time for us to respond to these Americans who have suffered too long and who need relief now. It is time we hear the voices of hundreds of thousands of our fellow citizens who have been devastated by the unintended consequences and the botched implementation of the Biggert-Waters Flood Insurance Act that led to dramatic increases in the cost of flood insurance. It is time that we, on this side of the Capitol, take up this legislation and address the problem before one more family suffers from increased premiums, depressed home prices, or the inability to sell their home. I hope, like what took place when we initially asked for relief for these victims, so I hope it is not the most extreme wing of the Republican Party that is blocking or stopping real relief for our nation's homeowners and pass this important reform legislation today. Madam Speaker, it is time that we pass the Homeowners Flood Insurance Act, and it's time that we get it done. We need it done today. We need it done right now for relief for American citizens. And I yield back.
Gentleman's time's expired. Gentleman from Texas.
I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Murphy.
Gentleman from Florida for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Last week, the Senate passed a bipartisan bill to fix the National Flood Insurance Program to protect homeowners from unaffordable rate hikes. It is beyond time for the House to follow suit by passing this bipartisan bill, which will help millions of Americans facing steep flood insurance rate increases, including thousands of residents across the Palm Beaches and Treasure Coast. The bill includes additional funding for FEMA to redraw flood maps accurately so homeowners do not face erroneous rate hikes in my district and around the country. Any proposed rate hikes must be delayed until the affordability study gives Congress a better understanding of how unaffordable rate hikes would negatively impact the flood insurance program. I urge my colleagues to defeat the previous question so we can pass this bipartisan, common-sense solution that will provide much-needed relief for homeowners across America. I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas.
I reserve my time.
Gentleman continues to reserve. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pasquarello.
Gentleman from New Jersey for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Madam Speaker, Mr. Chairman, I appeal to you to make this an urgent issue. Urgency, I think, is very critical here. So I rise in opposition to the previous question so that we can consider the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act. In the wake of Hurricane Sandy, over 74,000 national flood insurance program claims are submitted in New Jersey from policyholders. To date, the NFIP has paid over $3.5 billion in Sandy claims. It has served as a lifeline to thousands of New Jersey residents whose lives are turned upside down by the storm. The funds paid out through those claims have helped our neighbors rebuild our homes, businesses, regardless of what political affiliation, persuasion. We're all affected by this. Estimates indicate that the total cost of Sandy will be between $12 and $15 billion, making Sandy the second costliest flood event after Hurricane Katrina. So it is true that we need to make changes to ensure that NFIP remains solvent. However, the rollout of the 2012 reforms to NFIP have been fraught with issues. I'm hearing constituents of Little Ferry and Moonachie particularly, which were devastated by Sandy. This is destroying property values, disrupting the real estate markets in the communities of New Jersey and across this country. That's why it's so critical that we revisit flood insurance reform by passing H.R. 3370. This legislation will prevent premium rate hikes until FEMA completes the affordability study. Is there any possibility? 30 seconds? You got time?
I yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you. The affordability study called for by the original Biggert-Waters flood insurance reform legislation, giving FEMA a chance to implement an affordability framework. The bill establishes an appeal process for remapping and creates an advocate position within FEMA. Just last week, a bipartisan majority in the Senate did approve this bill, as you've already heard. It is time to bring this vital legislation to the floor. Again, I appeal to the chairman. This is urgent, not simply because we had two major storms in the last few years, but because Americans all over this country are affected one way or the other. If not by a storm off the ocean, a snowstorm, or even worse. So I ask you specifically, do what you can to make this, put this in front of us as soon as possible. Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman from Texas.
Madam Speaker, thank you very much, and I appreciate the gentleman from New Jersey, my dear friend, who joins with others of his colleagues who, in fact, most politely and appropriately have brought this issue to the Rules Committee. I will tell you that there was an assertion made a minute ago that I was unaware of, and that was a jurisdictional issue that evidently the Rules Committee does have. I've tried to be forthright with this the whole time, and that is that I believe it is the right thing for the men and women of the Democratic Party and the Republican Party who have approached me. I have consistently tried to invoke myself into the process with an answer through the committee, which I thought was the Committee of Jurisdiction, solely of jurisdiction. I will look at the gentleman from Massachusetts, the gentleman from New Jersey, both very dear friends who see me every day, and I see them. I am not trying to evade. I'm not trying to obfuscate. I'm not trying to pass the buck on this. I've indicated I will be willing to be a part of this compromise. I will look back at the gentleman, my friend, Mr. Pascal, and tell him I am personally involved in this. I will continue to be personally involved in it. I'm delighted that the Senate came up with their answer, which was a short-term answer, not a fix. And I believe that there's a fix that's tried to be looked at right now, one which is, I think, more amenable to the circumstance. If that effort fails, I will continue to stay in touch with not only the ranking member of the committee, Mrs. Slaughter, who's pressed me also, but also my friends who've approached me today. And I will very respectfully acknowledge that what they are doing here today to come to the floor to do this is appreciated. What I would say to them is, I don't know that voting against the rule, them believing they're going to take this down, would get this process done. It's not included in the rule, but I will tell each of my friends that are here today, I'm going to continue working on this, and I intend to have an answer quickly. And I appreciate the gentleman. I reserve my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch.
Gentleman from Florida for 1 minute.
Thank you. I thank my friend for yielding. Madam Speaker, last week the President called on Congress to embark on a year of action in which we all work together to put opportunity and financial security within the grasp of America's families. Just a few days later, the Senate took bipartisan action to protect thousands of homeowners in my home state of Florida and across the country for massive premium hikes on their flood insurance. These hikes are breaking the backs of America's families. They're bringing down home values at a time when our housing market is just starting to pick up again. There is no question that the financial health of the thousands of families who could lose their homes as a result of these premium rate increases has to be a priority, has to be an urgent priority of this House. Rather than gutting environmental protections, let's focus on the concerns of real homeowners. Let's pass the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act so that FEMA can reform the flood insurance program and protect America's families at the same time. It is urgent that we move forward. I thank the gentleman for making this an urgent priority. The way to do it, however, is to let us proceed with this today. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas.
Madam Speaker, I'll continue to reserve my time. Thank you.
Gentleman continues to reserve. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Ms. DeLauro.
Gentlelady from Connecticut for 1 minute.
The Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act overwhelmingly passed the Senate with bipartisan support. It needs to pass the House of Representatives. We need to stabilize flood insurance rates before families are further impacted by FEMA's poor implementation, inaccurate mapping, and incomplete data, which has led to unimaginable increases in premiums. We came together in a bipartisan basis in 2012 to reform the National Flood Insurance Program, put it on a path to stability. But Congress never intended to allow the punitive flood insurance premiums FEMA is now imposing on homeowners. A constituent of mine from Milford, Connecticut, anticipates paying a rate as much as 5,000% higher than he was paying. And yes, I have heard from many constituents. The Senate legislation would delay these increases until FEMA completes the study, ensuring that new rates are affordable for families, as was called for in the 2012 law. 182 members of this body, Republicans and Democrats, support a similar bill. We can get this done. We need to get this done, and we can do it today. I call on the Speaker to stop fiddling while Rome burns.
Gentleman from Texas.
I'll continue to reserve my time.
Gentleman continues to reserve. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Enyart.
Gentleman from Illinois for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to urge my colleagues to bring the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act up for a vote. It is crucial that we fix the critical problems created by the rushed implementation of the Insurance Act of 2012. We cannot ensure the National Flood Insurance Program's long-term viability at the expense of homeowners and potential buyers. Opponents of Senate-passed flood insurance bill say that it overwhelmingly benefits wealthy Americans who buy beachfront property. I urge those opponents to come to my Southern Illinois district. My district borders more than 150 miles on the mighty Mississippi. The folks who live there are not owners of second homes nor vacation rentals, but are middle-class families in Jackson County, Union County, Alexander County, and in the American bottoms of the Metro East St. Louis area. Without reform, people in my district and across the U.S. will see their property values plummet. Many of these properties have been family homes for generations and have never once endured flooding. I urge that we pass this act now.
Gentleman from Texas.
Madam Speaker, at this time I'll continue to yield to reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, this time I'm proud to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana, a co-sponsor of the Homeowners Flood Insurance Affordability Act, Mr. Richmond.
2 minutes to the gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I will take Mr. Sessions at his word, and I believe him to be sincere and genuine in his desire to see this problem fixed. I would just remind Mr. Sessions and Congress that we don't have time to wait on this issue. Every day there's a sale that's delayed or a sale that doesn't go through because the flood insurance is so high that the new purchaser doesn't want to pay for it, and every day the owner's short selling a house because they have to get out of it and they can't afford to wait. So when we talk about home ownership, we're talking about responsible Americans. We're talking about 1.7 million people in this country that saved up to participate in the bedrock of the American dream. And now government and FEMA and now Congress is turning their piece of the American dream into a government-made nightmare. And we have the ability here today to fix this. And the part about it is, right now, we're not asking for politics. We're not trying to be over-dramatic. We're just asking for a solution, and we want to fix it. In fact, we're here today talking about a Republican bill that solves the problem. That's because, for me, this is not about politics. It's about people. It's about purpose. And it's about making sure that not rich people who own riverfront and lakefront and oceanfront property are taken care of. It's about our seniors who own a home on Main Street or smack dab in our community that they saved, they sacrificed, they did everything right, played by all the rules. And now FEMA has come in and decided we're going to create new flood maps. And the sad part about it is that if you're a community and you built levees and you increased your flood protection and you did it with your own money, FEMA does not even count it because they didn't pay for it. So communities who have saved money to help themselves like we do in America, that if we have a problem, we fix it. So my communities that put up millions of dollars to build levees don't even get it recognized because the government didn't pay for it. So, Madam Speaker, I would just ask all my colleagues, let's do what's right. Let's help people and put people over politics. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas.
Madam Speaker, thank you very much. The gentleman from Louisiana is most accurate when he describes not just the problem, but problems which are associated with the way FEMA has initiated this process. I will not sit here and beat anyone up over what they did or did not do. I recognize that I have disagreements myself. I have disagreements with myself as a member of Congress from Dallas, Texas. But what I would say to the gentleman, and he is sitting right next to the ranking member of the Financial Services Committee, these are issues that have to be resolved. And they are larger, I believe, in what you've heard me say today. I think they're trying to look at solving more than just the extension problem. They're trying to solve some problems. I could be wrong about that. I'm not in the negotiation. I'm around the negotiation. But the gentleman, most assuredly, has come to the floor today for the right reason, I believe, with a pretty good message. Everybody is impacted that lives in these areas. We don't need to say one group of people or another, or people live in high rises or low rises. What we do need to say is, and acknowledge, and I do, that each of my colleagues, I've been approached by colleagues on the Republican side and the Democrat side. I intend to stay after this issue, and I respect the gentleman for the way he approached it today. And I owe him, I'm looking him right in the eye, I owe him an answer on this too. I'm part of the problem just as he is, and we got to find a solution. I'll reserve my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Frankel.
Gentlelady from Florida for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. We have a crisis in Florida and across this nation where our constituents are facing skyrocketing jumps in flood insurance premiums, making homeownership unaffordable. Madam Speaker, floods are not partisan, and homeownership makes communities safer, more secure, and more economically vibrant. Madam Speaker, let's fix this crisis now. I yield the rest of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Texas.
Madam Speaker, I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Massachusetts, my colleague, Mr. Lynch.
Gentleman from Massachusetts for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise today to urge a no vote on the previous question so this House can bring the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act up for a vote. This bipartisan legislation will provide a critical relief for families who have been devastated by outrageous flood insurance increases required by recent changes to the flood insurance program. FEMA's insistence on moving forward with these extreme rate hikes without first completing an affordability study and certifying that their mapping techniques are accurate, as required by Congress in the Biggert-Waters Act, has created a crisis for working families who can't afford to pay 5 or 10 times more for flood insurance. Before we ask the American taxpayer to pay 1 cent more in premiums, We need to ensure that FEMA is implementing the flood insurance program in a fair and lawful way. Now, we're not asking to repeal that law. We're just asking for a timeout while we figure this out. And we're asking that we do an affordability study so that we don't force people out of their homes. There's no sense doing it after the people are gone. We need this done the right way. We can help middle-class homeowners across the country by voting no on the previous question and bringing up the Homeowner Protection Act. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas.
I'll continue to reserve my time.
Reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman.
Gentleman from California for 1 minute.
I'm here with the ranking member of the Financial Services Committee. She and I represent a city built in the desert, suffering from a drought. We interrupted our rain prayer meeting to come here and to talk about how flood insurance is critical to the national interest. We should not burden our economy with a situation in which people can't buy their home, sell a home, live in their home. It's time for us to defeat the previous question motion and take up on the floor of this House a bill that had overwhelming bipartisan support in the Senate, that has 182 co-sponsors here in the House. It's time to stop partisan wrangling and deal with bipartisan legislation critical to homeowners from one coast to the other, and yes, a few in Los Angeles as well. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. With great respect to the gentleman, I would once again offer an explanation, and that is that this, what they're talking about with this motion recommit is not germane to the bill and would not go back to the Committee of Jurisdiction. And so by voting against what would be the rule or the motion to for a motion to recommit would not accomplish what the gentleman is trying to do. And that is why I've tried to take, Madam Speaker, as I've tried meticulously with speaker after speaker, my friends, my colleagues that have a strong opinion about this, I've tried to say to them that I do recognize that while I don't believe I have the jurisdictional elements within the Rules Committee, that I will continue to work on this and believe that there can be an answer. And so I would respond back to the gentleman from Los Angeles and tell him, thank you for coming to the floor. But an answer for this really needs to come from the committee, that we need to then work through the Rules Committee and get it on the floor. And I am committed to that entire process and will continue to do that. And I thank the gentleman from Los Angeles, my friend, for him taking time to come down. But I don't want him to believe that by winning a vote on the motion to recommit that it will have any impact on that endeavor. I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized and advised that he has 1.5 minutes remaining.
Madam Speaker, I have no further request for time. I will ask the gentleman if he has any other speakers.
I thank the gentleman. I have no further requests for speakers either, so I will let the gentleman go ahead and
Madam Speaker,
use his time.
I yield myself the balance of the time.
The gentleman's recognized.
Madam Speaker, first of all, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of my amendment in the record along with extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
And again, I urge all my colleagues to vote no and defeat the previous question. Madam Speaker, I appreciate the Chairman of the Rules Committee expressing his willingness to ponder and reflect and consider and contemplate and speculate on this legislation. But look, time is of the essence here. And if the House votes to defeat the previous question, we can bring this up. There's no reason why we can't bring this up. And the Rules Committee has jurisdiction over this issue too. And if there are any glitches here, quite frankly, the Rules Committee can meet immediately and waive all the rules, because that's what my friends do on so many other bills. Look, one of the frustrations that we have on our side of the aisle is that my friends on the majority keep on bringing bills to the floor that mean nothing, that are going nowhere. This issue of flood insurance is a big deal. You have heard from members from all across the country. They want action now, not sometime in the future. They want it now. And by voting to defeat the previous question, we can bring this up, we can deal with this, we can actually help some people in this country for a change and do the right thing. So I urge my colleagues to defeat the previous question, and if they don't defeat the previous question, defeat the rule. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Texas, who is advised that he has 5.5 minutes remaining.
Madam Speaker, thank you very much. Madam Speaker, I will once again do the very best that I can, and with great respect and appreciation to my very dear friend from Massachusetts, who has been a part of, since I recall, at least early December, the discussion in the Rules Committee with the gentleman, his colleague, my colleague from Florida, Mr. Hastings. Judge Hastings pushed this issue appropriately. The members of the committee from Florida have graciously pushed this issue forward. The bottom line is that I believe the gentleman and I need to meet to speak about the jurisdiction that he refers to. The jurisdiction that I believe that the Rules Committee has is not related to the policy. The policy, which is what the provisions that are contained within the problems that we're talking about today, the policy issues are within the jurisdiction of the Financial Services Committee. Today, we are on the floor of the House of Representatives with a rule with the jurisdiction to the Natural Resources Committee. The motion to recommit is not germane to the Natural Resources Committee. So voting or believing that you could, through a motion to recommit, winning that and getting this bill on the floor is simply, through the previous question, is simply not something that I believe is realistic or something that we should even suggest to people that would happen. What we are talking about today is a bill with the jurisdiction through the Natural Resources Committee, and I would like to confine my remarks now on the bill that is before the House. Madam Speaker, I have had the pleasure of growing up as a lifelong Texan, but had the opportunity to visit and live in other states in our great United States. I've had an opportunity to visit national parks, national lands, land that is owned by all the American people. As an active Eagle Scout and the father of 2 Eagle Scouts, and my father's an Eagle Scout, we have been in national parks all over this country. That's what this legislation is about today. It is about national parks and the use therein. Some number of bills that have been cobbled together. Yes, they were cobbled together so that we could come up with a policy that is trying to be worked on through a group of men and women here in the United States House of Representatives on a bipartisan basis, as well as a bicameral basis. We had an understanding that we would try and do this about this week, early last year. So I want you to know that what we're doing is bringing forth a bill which is important to people in how they deal with their families, recreation, as well as the importance of vital economic help to various areas of the United States. I've witnessed the educational and recreational opportunities that we're talking about today, and they possess near limitless opportunities for not only my generation, but the next generation of Americans who want to enjoy America. And I think that we today, by this bill, have given us a refreshed, new opportunity on a bipartisan, bicameral basis to address that issue. And that's why I support increasing access to public lands for hunting, fishing, and recreational shooting so others may have this same opportunity. So I am a yes, and would encourage my colleagues to be yes on what the legislation is about today, not something that's not germane, and another issue which I have tried to appropriately address here today. And it is urgent, but that's not what we're doing right here, right now. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the rule, yes on the underlying legislation, and to be a part of moving this bill to the Senate, then on to the President's desk. And I yield back my time and move the previous question on the resolution.
Gentleman yields back, and the question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed will say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
On that, I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, the chair will reduce to 5 minutes, the minimum time, for any electronic vote on the question of adoption of this resolution. This is a 15-minute vote, a 15-minute vote.
Mr. Nunnally. Mr. Nunnally votes aye. Mr. Lewis. Mr. Lewis votes no.
On this vote, the yeas are 225 and the nays are 193. The previous question is ordered. The question is on adoption of the resolution. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Opposed say nay. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Madam Speaker, on that I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having arisen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 5-minute vote. A 5-minute vote.
Members voted. On this vote, the yeas are 234, the nays are 185. The resolution is adopted without objection. The motion to reconsider is laid on the table. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks on and include extraneous material on H.R. 3590.
Without objection. Pursuant to House Resolution 470 and Rule 18, the Chair declares the House and the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of H.R. 3590. The Chair appoints the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Nugent, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
Will the House come to order? Okay. The House is the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for consideration of H.R. 3590, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to protect and enhance opportunities for recreational hunting, fishing, and shooting, and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read for the first time. The gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings, and the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio, each will control 30 minutes. Will the House come to order? The committee come to order. Will members take their conversations off the floor so the committee can come to order? Will members take their conversations off the floor so the committee can come to order? The committee will come to order. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the Sportsman's Heritage and Recreation Enhancement Act, H.R. 3590, is a package of 8 bills that protects the right of American sportsmen to fish and hunt from arbitrary and unjustified bureaucratic restrictions and limitations. It will remove government roadblocks to those activities on certain public lands and guard against new regulations that threaten hunting and fishing. Mr. Chairman, this is a bipartisan bill. It's co-sponsored by the Republican and Democrat chairs of the Congressional Sportsman Caucus, Mr. Latta of Ohio and Mr. Thompson of Mississippi, and the caucus vice chairs, Mr. Whitman of Virginia and Mr. Walz of Minnesota. In addition, Mr. Benishek of Michigan, Mr. Gibbs of Ohio, Mr. Hunter of California, Mr. Miller of Florida, and Mr. Young of Alaska all deserve credit for leadership on these important issues. Mr. Chairman, the House committee is not in order.
Gentleman's correct. The House will come to order. The committee will come to order. The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this legislation ensures that Americans' ability to fish and hunt will not be arbitrarily limited by the whim of federal bureaucrats. Title I of this bill directly responds to bureaucratic threats posed by the EPA. In 1976, Congress barred the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, from regulating firearms and ammunition. However, this has not stopped attempts to circumvent the law by claiming that while EPA may not be able to regulate ammunition, it can regulate components of ammunition and fishing tackle. This would be a massive power grab by the EPA despite a clear lack of legal authority. Banning lead bullets and tackle would increase costs for hunters, sport shooters, and fishermen and cause economic harm to outdoor sportsmen and the recreation industry. This legislation ensures that the EPA does not, Mr. Chairman, have the authority to regulate ammunition and fishing. Title II of this bill makes more funding available to states for a longer period of time to create and maintain shooting ranges, which of course preserves American tradition. Title III would direct the Secretaries of Agriculture and Interior to allow, with a permit, commercial filming on federal lands for crews of 5 or fewer. This permit would ensure a fair return to the taxpayer in exchange for use of their lands. Title IV of this bill would allow for the importation of legally taken polar bear hunting trophies from Canada that, through no fault of the hunters or the sportsmen, have become trapped in a bureaucratic limbo. This is focused squarely on resolving existing permits installed in red tape and does not open the door to any future imports. The next two titles of the bill would allow sportsmen across the country to more easily obtain a federal duck stamp by making them available for purchase online, and would protect law-abiding individuals' constitutional right to bear arms on lands owned by the Army Corps of Engineers. Title VII establishes a Wildlife and Hunting Heritage Conservation Council Advisory Committee in order to protect the rights of sportsmen while finding a balance between common sense conservation. And the last title of the bill requires the federal land managers to support and facilitate use and access for hunting, fishing, and recreation shooting on Forest Service and BLM land. It protects sportsmen from arbitrary efforts by the federal government to block public lands from hunting and fishing activities by implementing an open until closed management policy. However, Mr. Chairman, it does not prioritize hunting and fishing over other multiple uses of public lands. Mr. Chairman, hunting, fishing, and recreational shooting are long-standing American traditions that deserve our protection. This important legislation is not a solution in search of a problem. Regrettably, bureaucratic threats to hunting, fishing, and recreational shooting that are very real. That is why this bill has broad bipartisan support and the endorsement from over 36 sportsmen's organizations. So I again commend the bipartisan sponsors of these packages of bills, and I encourage my colleagues to support the legislation. And with that, I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
In the past, I have voted for a number of sportsmen's promotion and protection packages. Unfortunately, it seems that this one, with a number of extraneous provisions and detrimental provisions to wilderness, wildlife refuges, and other areas, seems designed to turn what in the past has been a bipartisan consensus in favor of sportsmen's issues into a partisan issue, which is what we do with most everything around here these days, and that's unfortunate, because we'd be happy to address real problems as they're identified. In this bill, we're going to essentially amend or override the Wilderness Act, the National Environmental Policy Act, Refuge System Administration Act. These are all bedrock environmental provisions which protect public lands and wildlife, and have not caused conflicts for sportsmen, hunters, and fishers and others. It also, I mean, we have the throwaway, little political thing. The EPA has already said we don't have the authority to regulate lead, and that's the end of it. But we're going to pass a law to say they don't have the authority that they don't have to regulate lead. Okay, whatever. That's fine. So then, we also have a very broad agreement that hunting, fishing, and other wildlife-dependent activities can and should, and have and will, ongoing, take place in wildlife refuges and wilderness areas. In fact, there's so much agreement on this point that existing law clearly supports such activities. As a result, hunting and fishing are popular and commonplace pursuit on public lands, the vast majority of which, outside of national parks in the lower 48, are open to hunting and fishing. Now, reasonable legislation seeking simply to emphasize the importance of these activities would have been non-controversial, and whatever minor adjustments we might need to make. But to have a blanket exemption for operations in the National Wildlife Refuge system from all environmental planning under NEPA, purpose of such a broad waiver is unclear. The motivation is unclear. It's definitely and potentially, or at least probably very, can't say definitely, but it could well undermine management in refuges in ways that will actually degrade habitat, which will mean less hunting and fishing opportunities, degrade water, which means less hunting and fishing opportunities, and that seems contradictory to the meritorious title of the bill, which doesn't seem to be reflected in the various parts, some of which have been through hearings, some of which haven't. Now, the filming on public lands, I haven't heard of the controversy. There's some who purport that there might be some kind of problem for people who want to do hunting, fishing, videos, films. I've seen quite a few of them on public lands. There is no example of a problem that has occurred, but the new authority with a fixed rate of a maximum of $200 for a permit, no matter how much the impact might be of the film crew, and further to open the door for the use of motorized equipment in wilderness areas for these filming activities is very problematic and objectionable and unnecessary at this point. Again, there's been nothing brought up in a hearing about a credible complaint from a film company that couldn't do its wildlife film or its hunting film because of restrictions that were placed upon them. It also would allow the construction of temporary roads. Now, I appreciate the fact the manager's amendment is going to prohibit permanent roads within wilderness areas that are designated necessary for access for hunting and fishing, but even temporary roads in wilderness areas, for hunting and fishing, are a clear and unnecessary degradation, a violation of the existing Wilderness Act. And many, horseback hunters or hunters who access on foot in my state, I've never been, petitioned by them to open up roads into wilderness areas so they can better hunt. They are concerned about the ongoing review and closure of roads by the Forest Service, and I've been actively involved in that. But in this case, we're saying, no, now we can have temporary roads into wilderness areas, something that no one has ever asked me and nor made a case is necessary for hunting. So it is slightly improved from the early versions, but we're still concerned about temporary roads. And that's not something we want in our wilderness areas. I don't think that weakening or changing the definition of wilderness helps expand access for hunting and fishing, nor the opportunities in those areas. The bill has some pretty glaring omissions that actually would tremendously benefit the sportsmen's communities. That would be programs that support wetlands conservation, the preservation of outdoor recreation facilities, North American Wetlands Conservation Act, Land and Water Conservation Fund, which are key in expanding opportunities or protecting continued opportunities to hunt and fish as we see more and more urban encroachment onto traditional hunting and fishing areas. We could use those tools. We need those tools. They're both expired, and they are not allowed to be part of this package. There were various other amendments offered that we will get to later in the discussion that were not allowed, that could have improved this package. So, we will go through the amendment process, try and deal with some of the concerns, but at this point, as written and introduced, I would urge my colleagues to oppose this bill. I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I'd like to yield 2 minutes to my colleague, the gentleman from Alaska, Mr. Young.
The gentleman from Alaska is recognized for 2 minutes.
Unanimous consent provided and extend.
Without objection.
I'm interested in Title IV in this legislation, which is a good piece of legislation. The provision in Title IV of 3590 has the support of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the President of the United States. And this provision is the Polar Bear Conservation and Fairness Act. It's a bipartisan measure that would make a very limited fix to an issue that affects a number of hunters nationwide. Prior to the threatened listing of the worldwide polar bear population on May 15, 2008, there were a number of hunters that took hunting trips to Canada under Canadian law and United States law. These hunters followed all the rules at the time and were prevented from bringing in their polar bear trophy due to the threatened listing triggering an importation ban under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. The legislation, my legislation, 3590, will allow the Secretary of Interior to issue permits to only those qualified hunters with legally taken polar bear trophies prior to the May listing dates. This legislation will allow up to 41 hunters to import their trophies from Canada. As a result, roughly 41,000 would be available to the United States, Russia, Polar Bear Conservation Fund to support conservation activities for the share of polar bear population. This provision that would bring in reserve for conservation activities that otherwise would not be funded. As a result, I urge the members to support this legislation and keep in fact these are dead polar bears in storage, hunted legally under the premise of Canadian law and United States law. This is a good part of this bill, and by the way, speaking of this bill, it is a good bill. From the state of Alaska has more parks and more refuges than any other state. The Refuge Department doesn't allow to hunt on refuges in many areas. Park Service definitely don't allow us to hunt. And I'm arguing that this park and refuge areas are set aside for the refuge managers themselves and not for the people of America, let alone the people of Alaska. This legislation is the right way to go. Let's think about public lands, not the king's lands, not the administration lands, but the lands of the people. This bill is a good bill. I urge the passage of this legislation.
The committee will rise informally to receive a message.
The House will be in order. The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the President of the United States.
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Secretary,
I'm directed by the President of the United States to deliver to the House of Representatives a message in writing.
The committee will resume its sitting.
The committee will be in order. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I'd yield the gentleman from Mississippi, co-chair of Sportsman's Caucus, as much time as he might consume.
The gentleman from Mississippi is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And let me thank the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from Oregon, for allowing me to speak in support of this legislation, even though he has reserved time in opposition. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of H.R. 3590, the Sportsman Heritage and Recreational Enhancement Act of 2013. Today's bill is the product of the work of members of the bipartisan Congressional Sportsman's Caucus, which I serve as co-chair. The Congressional Sportsman's Caucus is the largest caucus in Congress, boasting nearly 300 members. The caucus seeks to advance hunting, angling, shooting, and trapping legislative priorities. Today's bill is comprised of 8 individual bills that seek to promote these interests. Mr. Speaker, not only is hunting and fishing a great passion for millions of individuals like myself, it is also a major contributor to the U.S. economy. Mississippi, home to some of the world's finest duck, whitetail, and sport fishing, contributed $2.2 billion to the economy in 2011 alone. My congressional district receives scores of visitors each year, including some members of this body who come to enjoy the vast natural resources that the Mississippi Delta has to offer. When these individuals visit Mississippi, they hire local outfitters, stay in our hotels, eat at our restaurants, pay state hunting fees, and purchase hunting gear like Primo's brand hunting calls, which are produced in my district in Flora, Mississippi. In fact, it has been estimated that hunting and fishing supports 33,000 jobs in Mississippi. Mr. Speaker, the bill before us today makes improvements to a wide range of issues, including the ability to purchase duck stamps online, statutorily established the Wildlife Hunting and Heritage Conservation Council, which was administratively formed by Secretaries Salazar and Vilsack in 2012. It also reduces the financial burden on states and local governments for target range construction and maintenance. Also, it excludes commercial ammo and fishing tackle from being classified as toxic substances, which the EPA has agreed. It also directs the Secretary of the Interior and the Secretary of Agriculture to issue a permit and assess an annual fee for commercial filming crews of 5 people or fewer for activities on federal lands and waterways administered by the Secretary. It also allowed law-abiding citizens to transport firearms across Army Corps of Engineers projects like the hundreds of miles of levee that I have in my district. It also opens more federal land to hunting and fishing. Mr. Speaker, while this bill makes tremendous strides to advance the needs of sportsmen, there are several other provisions that were not included in this bill that we must continue to push for, and including an overhaul of the red snapper management of the Gulf of Mexico, the ability to convert decommissioned oil rigs to fish habitat, and the reauthorization of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. I look forward to working with my colleagues to also address these issues. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting H.R. 3590, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today to offer my support for H.R. 3590, the Sportsman's Heritage and Recreational Enhancement Act of 2013, better known as the SHARE Act. And I commend my friend and co-chair of the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus, Representative Bob Latta of Ohio, for his leadership in guiding this bill to the floor. I'm also proud to join with the Sportsmen's Caucus co-chairs, both Representative Latta, Representative Betty Thompson of Mississippi, and Vice Chair Representative Tim Waltz of Minnesota in support of this important bill. As a member of the Natural Resources Committee, I would also like to thank Chairman Doc Hastings for his work in cooperation on behalf of America's sportsmen to support this legislation through the committee process. As a sportsman, I am humbled to advocate for this community and help introduce this legislation to advance priorities for American anglers, hunters, and conservationists. This common sense package will expand opportunities for recreation, support fair treatment, and modernize programs for sportsmen, and includes a proposal I authored to allow migratory waterfowl hunters to purchase their annual federal duck stamp online. As Vice Chair of the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus, I can proudly say that this provision is important to waterfowl hunters across the country. Title V, the Permanent Electronic Duck Stamp Act, is supported by the Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation and Ducks Unlimited. I would also like to acknowledge Representative Ron Kind as an original co-sponsor of the Permanent Electronic Duck Stamp Act. The gentleman from Wisconsin is a dedicated conservation and longtime supporter and friend to sportsmen. There is no cost to taxpayers, and there is broad bipartisan support for this innovative idea, And this convenient 21st century delivery system will be utilized by thousands of American sportsmen in the future. Again, I would encourage my colleagues to support this important package, H.R. 3590, the Sportsman's Heritage and Recreational Enhancement Act. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Just inquires how much time on either side.
The gentleman has 19 and a half minutes remaining. The gentleman from Michigan has 21 and a half minutes remaining.
I grant the gentleman from California, Mr. Farr, 5 minutes.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in opposition to this legislation, and I would hope that my colleagues will read it, look before they leap. It's called the Sportsman's Heritage and Recreational Enhancement Act of 2013. But unfortunately, it's mired in a muck of text in the legislation that I think does just the opposite of enhancement. It ought to read, Kill the Habitat and Wildlife and Enjoy a Dead Forest Act. This bill diminishes the conservation measures designed to protect the habitat for wildlife by creating loopholes in the Wilderness Act and weakens the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA process. Title I, for example, amends the Toxic Substance Control Act to prohibit the EPA from regulating toxic substances contained in bullets, angling lures, and other hunting equipment with respect to toxic substances. Toxic substances. It's not just people that are affected by toxic substance, so are animals. And here they prohibit barring lead in bullets. Now, California is a big hunter state. And guess what? California state law prohibits the use of lead. Why? Because the federal government has spent millions and millions of dollars trying to restore the California condor. Does that count? Well, ask the Ventana and Post Ranch Inns. Post Ranch is $1,000 a night. Nobody can afford that, but it's filled all the time. Why? Because you can see condors and mountain lions and sea otters and other things that we've protected by protecting their environment. Now, what does a condor die from? It eats dead things. It eats things that have been killed by bullets. And it eats that lead, and guess what? It kills the condor. It's done it over and over again. There's no question about this. This is the #1 cause of death in condors in California after we spent all this money trying to get them restored. This act wipes all that out. It's going to hurt the economy. And you know what? People call themselves sportsmen. Sportsmen I know don't want to kill the wildlife by poison or destroying the habitat. That's why the bill passed in California, banning lead bullets. And this one prohibits states like California from doing that. You know, even the military is moving toward pursuing a lead-free environment for their small arms. So it's a serious problem. And this bill bans that. This is nuts. Lead poisoning from ammunition is the way you kill off wildlife. Not by a good shot. You kill it off by the poison that's left behind. And that's why Governor Brown signed into law a ban on lead bullets. And they phase it in to 2019. This allows at least 30 other states, follows what at least 30 other states have already done in regulating lead ammunition in some manner. So, if we want to really protect and enhance the environment, then we ought to do what the original conservationists did. Who were the hunters? By switching to non-toxic ammunition and allow them to continue on good conservation efforts, which is a heritage of hunters in this country. So this legislation is a step backwards for a sportsman. I'm a fisherman. I certainly don't want to put stuff in the ocean or in lakes that is toxic. And conservation practices that protect our public lands, our open spaces, and our wilderness areas. So I urge my colleagues to look before you leap. Don't jump in and just because there's a bunch of people endorsing this bill, look at the type. Look what it does. Look at the small print. And I urge you to oppose this legislation until it can really be legislation that will be a sportsman's heritage and a recreational enhancement act. As now, it deserves your opposition.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I'd like to yield myself 2 minutes of the time.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise today in support of H.R. 3590, the Sportsman's Heritage and Recreational Enhancement Act of 2013, or the SHARE Act. I'd like to talk a little bit about Title 8 of this bill, which is the text of a bill that I introduced, the Recreational Fishing and Hunting Heritage and Opportunities Act. Like many of my colleagues here in Congress, hunting and fishing are an important part of the lives of the constituents in my district. I grew up in northern Michigan, and like many of my constituents, spent my summers fishing, my Octobers hunting grouse in the UP woods. These traditions, spending quality time outdoors with our kids and grandkids, are the kind of things that we must make sure are preserved for generations to come. Mr. Chairman, this portion of the SHARE Act seeks to create an open until closed policy for sportsmen's use of federal lands. As you know, nearly a quarter of the United States landmass, or over 500 million acres, are managed by the Bureau of Land Management, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Forest Service. These lands are all owned by all Americans. It is important that the right to fully utilize these lands is ensured for future generations. Over the years, legislative ambiguity in the Wilderness Act has opened the door for numerous lawsuits across the country. Rather than embracing sportsmen and women for the conservationists that they are, anti-hunting and environmental groups have pursued an agenda of eliminating heritage activities on federal lands for years. These groups look for loopholes in the law to deprive our constituents the right to use their own federal lands. Recreational anglers, hunters, and sporting organizations, many of whom have endorsed this bill, are supporters of the conservation movement and continue to provide direct support to the wildlife managers and enforcement officers at the state, local, and federal level. These dedicated sportsmen and women, from the shorelines of Lake Superior to the beaches of the Pacific Ocean, deserve to know that the lands that they cherish will not be closed off to future generations. This is a bipartisan issue. In fact, Presidents Clinton and Bush both issued executive orders recognizing the value of these heritage activities. It is time we finally close these loopholes, firm up the language, and make sure that future generations will always be able to enjoy the outdoors, hunting, fishing, and shooting, or just taking a walk in the woods. I will yield myself another 15 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized.
I would encourage all my colleagues today to join me in supporting this important piece of common sense legislation and yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman, does the gentleman reserve his time?
Right. Absolutely.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Oh, I misplaced what I was going to say. How many more speakers does the gentleman have?
I have 6 more, Mr. Chairman.
6 more. Well, I'd suggest that I have no more except myself, so I'd suggest that the gentleman go ahead.
Reserve?
I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Then I'd yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Wyoming, Mr. Daines. Oh.
The gentleman from Montana is recognized for 2 minutes.
Montana, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise today in support of H.R. 3590, the SHARE Act. As a fifth-generation Montanan and a lifelong sportsman, I know that hunting, fishing, motorized recreation, and hiking is simply a way of life for us in Montana. The outdoors is a critical aspect of our culture. And as 30% of our state is owned by the federal government, we depend on responsible stewardship and public access to these lands. And unfortunately, our federal government too often imposes rules and regulations that prevent responsible land use and our freedom to use the land that we pay for. Roughly 2 million acres in Montana are inaccessible to the public. That's the most of any state in the nation. Many of our hunting and fishing opportunities are locked away. The SHARE Act is an important bill that will protect Montanans' access to public lands for outdoor recreation. And too often, the federal government forgets that it's hunters, anglers, outdoorsmen, those whose livelihoods and passions rely on the land, that they respect our outdoor landscape the most and are the best stewards of our public lands. And here we have the federal government trying to expand its authority over lead bullets, keeping millions of dollars spent on ammo and fishing tackle by hunters and anglers from being used for the conservation and wildlife management. Like a Senate counterpart, the SPORT Act, this bill would protect our sportsmen and industries that manufacture these goods from these unnecessary regulations. The SHARE Act would also protect our Second Amendment rights, where the administration has tried to constrain them. It ensures that state and local governments are consulted in decisions managing shooting ranges, and ensures that real outdoorsmen, instead of a bunch of Washington bureaucrats, are advising the administration on conservation of sportsman issues. Simply stated, the SHARE Act is an important bill to protect America's outdoor heritage and ensure the responsible use of our public lands. I urge passage of this bill. I yield back my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I'd like to yield at this time 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I rise today in support of H.R. 3590, the Sportsman's Heritage and Recreational Enhancement Act, or SHARE Act. I have introduced this legislation on behalf of the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus, of which I am a co-chairman, with Congressman Benny Thompson, of whom I thank for his work. I also would like to thank Chairman Hastings for his support of the various bills contained in the Sportsman's Package, as well as Chairman Schuster and Chairman Upton. I would also like to thank all of my colleagues that have introduced the individual bills that make up this package legislation. As a lifelong hunter and outdoorsman, issues relating to hunting and conservation are extremely important to me. This legislation includes various pro-sportsmen and pro-sportswomen's items that will help ensure our outdoor traditions are protected and advanced. H.R. 3590 also addresses some of the most current concerns of America's hunters, recreational anglers, shooters, and trappers. Title III of the bill is legislation I introduced related to public lands filming. This provision directs the Secretary of the Interior and the Secretary of Agriculture for any film crew of 5 persons or fewer to require, permit, and assess an annual fee of $200 for commercial filming, activities, or similar projects on federal lands and waterways administered by the Secretary. This prohibits the Secretary for persons holding such a permit from assessing any additional fee for commercial filming activities and similar projects that occur in those areas during public hours. I have also introduced the language contained in Title VII, which permanently establishes the Wildlife Hunting and Heritage Conservation Council Advisory Committee. This council advises the Secretary of Interior and Agriculture on wildlife and habitat conservation, recreational hunting, and shooting. Authorization of the council is vital to ensuring that hunters maintain an advisory capacity role across future administrations. Passage of H.R. 3590 will not only elevate the stature of the council, it will also provide the levels of certainty and stability necessary to ensure the Council's ability to engage in assisting the government in devising and implementing the innovative long-term solutions that are often necessary.
I'll yield to him another
30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized for another 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. Long-term solutions that are often necessary to address policy issues important to sportsmen and sportswomen. The passage of H.R. 3590 is important to our sportsmen and women to allow open access to federal lands as well as to provide needed certainty for the rules surrounding these activities. These hunters and anglers provide a tremendous economic benefit to our country. In 2011, they spent over $90 billion. In my home state of Ohio, sportsmen and sportswomen spent $2.85 billion on hunting and fishing. That is more than the revenues for corn, the state's top grossing agricultural commodity that year. H.R. 3590 is good for the sporting and conservation communities, and I urge my colleagues to support the bill. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Yield myself such time as I may consume. If Mr. Latta would remain on the floor for a moment, Mr. Latta, if you would, I'll yield you some time. I'd like to direct a question about the filming provision because it seems I'm curious what problems specifically have been identified regarding filming permits. And the second question would be, is it the gentleman's intent that they should be able to use mechanized filming, on tracks and otherwise motorized filming in wilderness areas? With that, I yield to the gentleman.
I appreciate the gentleman for yielding. And first, there's a lot of smaller companies out there that don't have the large film crews, and they don't have the large backup when it comes to funding to be able to do these types of activities. So we want to make sure that those individuals have that ability to be out there and with a smaller fee, so they can go ahead and make the films that they want to make.
Well, reclaiming my time for a moment, as I understand the current process, the fees are, there is not one large fee. The fees vary in terms of the agency. I mean, if it's a one-person crew or a four-person crew or whatever, the fees would be smaller. And if it's if it's a mega film coming from Hollywood, they would charge a larger fee, is my understanding. And I'm just wondering if there has been a specific case, where someone has come to the gentleman and said, gee, we're a two-person crew and they want to charge us $10,000. Do we have any specific examples? I yield to the gentleman.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding. Again, what we've had come to us from the discussions we had with the sporting community. And again, this is a product of multiple groups coming together, and this is when we looked at the cost, the fee, etc., they thought it'd be appropriate at this level at $200 for the annual fee, again, for these very small groups out there that want to go out and film.
Okay, and further, is the issue of mechanized filming equipment, motorized, being used in wilderness areas?
Well, that is one of the,
I yield to the
that's one of the sections in the title that would permit that.
You feel that we should waive the Wilderness Act for film crews, but not other activities?
Well, if the gentleman, I thank the gentleman for yielding. Again, when you look at a mechanized vehicle, it could be anything from a very small ATV. And might not be talking about a truck or something like that, but something very small.
Okay. Well, thank you. In reclaiming my
thanks
time.
Thanks for the gentleman for yielding.
I think that this is a solution in search of a problem. We have had no testimony before the committee, and no specifics were provided here, and I believe it's an overly broad provision. If we had cases where extortionate fees were being charged for small groups or unreasonable fees that weren't following the scaling basis that the agency tells me they follow, then I would share the gentleman's concerns. With that, I'd reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Michigan.
At this time, I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Miller.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman. I thank Chairman Hastings for support in including H.R. 322, the Hunting, Fishing, and Recreational Shooting Protection Act, as Title I of this sportsman's package. And I want to thank my Congressional Sportsman's Caucus colleagues and the leadership, Chairman Bob Latta and Benny Thompson, their efforts to protect sportsmen's right and preserve our nation's heritage. Now, Title I of this measure simply clarifies the existing intent of law regarding EPA's authority under the Toxic Substance Control Act with respect to traditional ammunition and fishing tackle that contain lead components. This legislation would prevent EPA from expanding its regulatory authority under TSCA into an area where fish and wildlife agencies are better positioned to manage. What the several anti-hunting and anti-fishing groups who insist on the expansion fail to recognize is that the ammunition, the firearms, the tackle industries, along with sportsmen and women, are the ones that are footing the bill to manage, protect, and create the same species habitat that they claim they're trying to save. There is no sound evidence of traditional ammo and fishing tackle with lead components causing harm to wildlife populations or human health that would warrant a complete ban. I would also say that one of my colleagues came to the floor earlier and said that this particular piece of legislation would in fact prevent states like California from banning lead ammunition. That is not true. Doing so in disregard of the intent of the law, EPA would devastate countless domestic manufacturing facilities, drive up the costs for law enforcement and for our military, destroying thousands of jobs and hurting wildlife conservation funding, all at the expense of the taxpayer. And that is a cost that should not be borne. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Oregon.
If the gentleman would remain on the floor for a moment, Mr. Miller. Sir? Mr. Miller. I guess he doesn't want to remain on the floor. Okay. I was going to direct a question to him, which is, since the EPA has found it does not have legal authority to legislate these substances, why do we need to pass a law to prevent a law from being passed, which I guess is what we're trying to do here? In case we wanted to ever consider a law to do this, we'd say, well, we've already passed a law to prohibit that. Because the EPA says they don't have the authority to do this. It's not going to happen. There was a petition filed. It was rejected. End of story. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Michigan.
At this time, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Schuster.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman, and Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 3590, the Sportsman's Heritage and Recreational Enhancement Act. The bill protects the Second Amendment rights of visitors to the Army Corps recreation lands. The Army Corps of Engineers has more outdoor recreation visitors than the National Park Service or the Forest Service lands. My district is home to many of these recreational lands, such as Lake Raystown or the Youghiogheny River. While we currently have protections for American Second Amendment rights in national park lands and forest lands, that same right does not protect our Corps properties, and this bill corrects that. It removes unnecessary firearm restrictions while maintaining the safety and security of Corps buildings and properties. I urge all members to support the Second Amendment and vote in favor of H.R. 3590, the Sportsman's Heritage and Recreational Enhancement Act, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Bill,
The gentleman from Oregon.
I yield myself such time as I may consume. I'd like to ask my
recognized.
chairman a question regarding that, since this is under the jurisdiction of our committee, and I'm not aware that we held a hearing on this issue. Did we yield?
I don't believe we did this
Okay.
year, but I think in the past we did.
And the gentleman said that this would not. I have many core areas in my district, and I'm reclaiming my time, and I'm not aware of restrictions, except there are restricted areas because a number of these projects have sensitive equipment that operates spillways and dams and other things, and those are high security areas post 9/11. And I'm wondering if the gentleman's interpretation of this is that it would allow people to carry sidearms into these high security areas. I'd yield to the gentleman.
It protects people's rights to, just like on the state forests and the other properties of the federal government, to carry firearms on, law-abiding citizens. So I think it's something reasonable and something I support. So I thank the gentleman for the inquiry.
Well, I think I'm reclaiming my time. I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment and a gun owner myself, and I'm not aware of, I haven't had a single complaint about core restrictions in my state, and that would include areas where we have had tampering with machinery that relates to spillways and dams, potential terrorism, and I wouldn't want to facilitate terrorism by saying, well, if we're talking about general core areas and lands managed, fine. But if we're talking about sensitive, secure areas that have to be protected and guarded, I don't see why we would allow civilian firearm carry within those sensitive, protected areas, which would make us vulnerable to terrorism. Terrorists without a weapon, I suppose they could bring in a weapon anyway, they can violate the law, but if someone were noted bringing a weapon into one of those areas now, they would be asked to leave or apprehended. So I'm concerned about those aspects, and I think that my committee and Homeland Security should have looked at this issue before it was brought to the floor without a hearing. With that, I'd retain the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Michigan.
I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gibbs.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of H.R. 3590, the Sportsman's Heritage and Recreational Enhancement Act of 2013. I would like to speak specifically to Title VI of the bill. The fundamental constitutional right to bear arms must be protected for all law-abiding citizens. Americans deserve the right to exercise their rights to not only enjoy recreational activities, but also to provide self-defense for themselves and their loved ones. In the 111th Congress, this body passed legislation that ultimately became law, which allows for guns to be legally possessed and carried on lands within our national parks. Following the enactment of that legislation, the Army Corps of Engineers immediately issued the following release. Public Law 111-024 does not apply to Corps projects or facilities. The passage of this new law does not affect application of Title 36 regulations. The Corps administers over 11.7 million acres of land, including 400 lakes and rivers projects, 90,000 campsites, and 4,000 miles of trails. Much of this land is remote and without quick access to emergency services or law enforcement, so the ability to carry a firearm in the case of emergency is imperative. This Army Corps policy preempts state regulatory frameworks for transporting and carrying firearms, thus invalidating concealed carry weapons permits and other state laws that allow law-abiding citizens to exercise their Second Amendment rights. Title VI of the bill is aimed at protecting these rights by ensuring the right of carry at U.S. Army Corps of Engineers water resource development projects. Specifically, this legislation prohibits the Secretary of the Army from enforcing any regulation that prevents an individual from possessing firearms on these properties, thereby restoring the continuity to federal law. Gun owners need to be able to exercise their Second Amendment rights when they are legally camping, hunting, and fishing in an Army Corps project. I'd like to thank my colleague from Ohio, Representative Latta, for including my bill into this piece of legislation. I urge members to support Title VI and this legislation in the whole. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Oregon.
Inquire how many more speakers?
We just have one more speaker.
So that'll be your closing speaker, or you're going to close?
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to close after that.
So you're counting yourself as one? Or one more? Because I will go just before you close.
I have one more speaker, and then I'm going to close.
Okay, so I will go. I would reserve at this point.
Gentleman from Michigan.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Hunter.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank the gentleman and the ranking member and the committee as well for putting in the H.R. 2463, the Target Practice and Marksmanship Training Support Act that Congressman Walz from Minnesota and myself wrote. Basically, what this does is it allows Americans to use federal lands that they pay for in order to go out and shoot for sport, to have practice ranges and target ranges, and with fewer rangers today, providing greater flexibility to states for the purpose of maintaining public shooting venues, and it will go a long way to restoring the recreational opportunities and promoting gun safety. In San Diego, there are no public ranges that we can go use. We have to go to an indoor range, or we have to go to someone's private ranch. There are no more public facilities. The Target Practice and Marksmanship Training Support Act uses existing resources to allow Americans greater access to lands on which to safely practice recreational and competitive shooting. Shooting sports participants already provide significant support to conservation efforts through the excise taxes on firearms and ammunition, and public shooting ranges will continue to serve the interests of families and communities, providing a safe place for target practice and instruction while also sustaining jobs and supporting local businesses. This is a great bill. It's a great overall bill. I would urge my colleagues to support it, because shooting and shooting well is an American tradition, and you shouldn't just have to join the Marine Corps to learn that. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Oregon.
I thank the chair. I would agree with the gentleman and appreciate that came out of committee unanimously.
Great.
It is a true bipartisan proposal, and I learned to shoot through the Y in a basement range with 22. That was where I started. So anyway, we've got to learn somewhere, and the public lands is another place for families to go and learn to shoot. So that's one of the non-controversial parts of the bill. In fact, 4 of the components of this bill could have been brought up under suspension, or even, I believe, unanimous consent yesterday. Definitely under suspension. They definitely would have passed and been previously considered by committee, been subject to hearings, and the language was agreed upon. Unfortunately, the majority has insisted, although I also believe that the title would get unanimous consent in this body. It's a great title, but sometimes we attach provisions to great titles that aren't necessary or belie that title. And some of the components of this, which I've talked about, and the potential for degradation of wetlands management, wildlife refuge management, intrusions into wilderness areas, that are inappropriate are unnecessary. That's, we can do a little political gotcha. You voted against this bill that, has this great title, so that means you're against sportsmen and fishing and, hunters and families, enjoying those activities. I'm not, and very few, if any, members of this body are. But be that as it may, we've pointed out a number of the problems in this legislation. Legislating is really a pretty difficult exercise, to do real things, to do things that actually would benefit our wildlife resources and hunting and fishing activities. One would be Congressman Daines' proposal to reauthorize the Land Water Conservation Fund. Every day, development proposals move forward that take more and more wildlife areas, more and more wetlands, more and more forests out of access to hunting and fishing and recreation in many cases. The Land and Water Conservation Fund has been a key in protecting those lands when jeopardized and purchasing from willing sellers to prevent that kind of development. The bill, although we're still collecting the tax that funds the Land and Water Conservation Fund, yes, we are collecting the tax. Even the Republicans haven't proposed that we do away with that tax, because they're spending Land and Water Conservation funds on other things. God only knows what. Some of the earmarks in a bill we'll take up later this week, I don't know. But they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars that are supposed to go to benefit sportsmen and women, hunters, fishers, wildlife, and protect those areas and manage them reasonably with that full access. They are spending that money somewhere else. So they don't want to take away the tax, but they don't want to reauthorize the Land Water Conservation Fund. That's a shame, and that would be much bigger benefit than anything else we're doing here today. We have a number of bipartisan wilderness proposals pending. Mr. Reichert from Washington State, Alpine Lakes, Mr. Benishek, Sleeping Bear Dunes, and others that are pending. Those things would benefit since wilderness does allow hunting and fishing and does provide a degree of protection for those lands that is unparalleled. That would be an experience for horseback hunters, people who will walk in on their own 2 feet. But there's plenty of places to go in a motorized way. It's a little more rare to have an opportunity to do that from horseback or hiking. But we're not considering those today because those are controversial. So instead, we have this kind of hash that we're calling one thing and doing a number of other things with. We have the proposal that we have a problem with unidentified film crews who have never come forward, who might be charged too much or need to use motorized equipment in wilderness areas, and so therefore we're just going to open them up. That is kind of a heck of a way to legislate, really. We're worried that maybe some units and definitely the dam areas of the Corps of Engineers prohibit individuals carrying weapons. That's not exactly in the truth. You can't carry a weapon into an airport. You can't carry a weapon into the Capitol. You can't carry a weapon into a federal courthouse. And you can't carry a weapon to a dam site where tampering with equipment could cause a massive flood or dam failure. It makes a little bit of sense to me, but the bill says, no, that's an infringement on the Second Amendment. I think it's a reasonable step by the government. So we're going to open that up, again, without any hearings, identifying any problems with access. I have a lot of Corps projects in my state. I've never had a constituent call and say, gee, I want to go onto this Corps property and bring my gun. I've got a concealed weapons permit, and I've carried, a gun on many federal lands, and there is no restriction, and I supported the park provisions last year. But we're creating another imaginary problem so we can add yet another title to this hash of a bill. I'm sorry that, we're having to go forward in this way. I did support a less controversial measure for sportsman heritage in the last Congress, and even that didn't go anywhere in the Senate. This one already has an affirmed veto threat from the White House, and the Senate isn't going to take it up. But we can pretend we did something here today, and some people get excited about the fact that we did something here today that will never happen. We could, and it's much harder, agree on a bipartisan measure for reasonable measures to protect people's right to hunt and fish and bear arms, but we're not going to do that. So let's get on with the political show. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself the balance of the time.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, let me just make a couple of points. I want to make a very, very broad point on what the intent of this legislation is, because it's aimed at uses of public lands. Now, I have always been of the mind that public lands, particularly federal lands, should be used, unless Congress designates otherwise, then the uses of those lands should be for multiple purposes. Now, obviously, recreation, i.e. hunting and fishing, would be part of that. And so what this bill seeks to do then is to provide certainty into federal laws that indeed multiple uses, in this case hunting and fishing or recreational use, will be on public lands. It's nothing really more complicated than that. And what has caused this legislation to be brought forward is because of actions of certain bureaucracies within certain parts of the federal government that have a different decision, if you will, or a different idea of that, and they slow down this recreational activity. So this seeks to put certainty in that. And lastly, let me just respond to the arguments that we heard about the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Mr. Chairman, that is a program. There are people that think it's a very, very good program. There are those that, including me, that feel that sometimes it is not as good as it is, simply because you acquire private land for the federal government. We can't maintain what we have. I mean, that should be a reason for, I guess, pause anyway. But the reason I think that the Rules Committee did not make that particular amendment in order is for a very, very good reason. We talk about regular order around here. The Land and Water Conservation Fund statute does not expire until 2015. So I know, as chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee, that the subcommittee in charge of that particular legislation is going to have hearings, and we're going to go through the legislative process in order to reauthorize that. So to rail against the idea that that amendment was not made in order somehow continues to break the program is simply not the case. The program is in place until it expires at the end in 2015, and I have no doubt that our committee will come up with legislation to do the proper reauthorization. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I think it's a very, very good bill, and I urge my colleagues to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule and shall be considered as read. No amendment to the bill is in order except those printed in House Report 113-339. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered by a member designated in the report, shall be considered read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It's now in order to consider amendment number 1 printed in House Report 113-339. For what purpose does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 1, printed in House Report number 113-339, offered by Mr. Hastings of Washington.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Hastings, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Mr. Chairman, this amendment makes several technical and clarifying changes to the bill and conforms the bill text to which was favorably reported from the Committee on Natural Resources. Let me cite just some of these small changes in the amendment. It includes a saving provision regarding the effect of the Act on Indian tribes' treaty or other recognized rights. It clarifies that. It also provides clearer language that the provision of opportunities to hunt, fish, and shoot on certain federal lands, and I'll quote, shall not authorize or facilitate commodity development, use or extraction, motorized vehicle access, road construction, or maintenance or use not otherwise allowed under the Wilderness Act. That clarifies that. It also incorporates an amendment filed by our colleague, the sponsor of the legislation, Mr. Latta, to Title VII of the bill to correct a sunset date for the existing advisory council. So, as I understand, the manager's amendment is something that has been vetted, and I urge its adoption, and I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserved. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
Yield myself such time as I may consume.
Is the gentleman claim the time in opposition?
I am. Although, in the end, I won't. I am.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Now, I appreciate there are some clarifications in this amendment which we do support, but there are a few remaining oversights. There was an amendment by Del Bene and Kilmer from Washington State that specified that tribal jurisdiction is not to be infringed upon, where this language is not the this blanket language in the Hastings Amendment protecting tribal rights could well not be read. We're supposedly in a number of places here we're chasing chimeras. Is that the pronunciation? The illusions, threats with some of the provisions about the film permitting and that. But this might be real, which is this does not deal with the potential for disputes between tribes and neighboring landowners or between tribes. And so therefore, it would have been better to have the broader language of Del Bene and Kilmer, which specified treaty-protected rights of the individual tribal members are protected, whereas this amendment only protects the rights of the tribe itself. So I worry that we're creating a loophole here that doesn't adequately protect the sovereignty of tribes and all of their members. The amendment does attempt to address some of the wilderness issues in Title VII, the so-called Recreational Fishing and Hunting Heritage Act, which fails to address the wilderness issues in Title III, filming on public lands. We've already had extensive discussion of that. No identified problem, no hearing. Nobody's ever said we need this, but it's in there. We're going to allow mechanized film crews into wilderness areas. And then Title VII creates a loophole that will allow motorized equipment and vehicles into federal wilderness areas. Now, not with permanent roads, with only temporary roads or driving off-road, to facilitate hunting in wilderness areas or otherwise restricted, areas, wildlife refuges and that. And we still find that very problematic. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from Washington.
I urge adoption of the amendment, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Washington. All those in favor will say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It's now in order to consider amendment number 2, printed in the House Report 113-339. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in House Report number 113-339, offered by Mr. Hanna of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Hanna, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Thank you. I rise today in strong support of the SHARE Act and am pleased to be a sponsor of this bill. The SHARE Act allows more Americans to enjoy outdoor hobbies such as hunting, fishing, and recreational shooting on public lands. Not only do these activities provide our constituents with enjoyable hobbies and pastimes, they also contribute to our communities by creating and supporting diverse jobs in every congressional district. When families travel in activities in the outdoors, they spur demand for outdoor products and services and create jobs in the manufacturing, outfitting, retail, lodging, and hospitality industries. I am proud that the village of Ilion in my congressional district is home to our nation's oldest continually operating manufacturing company, Remington Arms. Remington manufactures firearms for hunting and recreational shooting and sustains more than 1,400 well-paying union jobs in New York's Mohawk Valley. Legislators in Washington and in Albany should take concrete steps to support these private sector jobs and not threaten them. And I am pleased the House is taking this action today. By opening new lands for recreational use and by making the joys of outdoors more accessible to average Americans, we can assist important sectors of our economy without spending taxpayer dollars. My amendment would simply quantify the economic impacts of this act by detailing how the new recreational opportunities it provides will create jobs, boost wages, and generate new local, state, and federal revenue. It is my hope that by highlighting the connection between sportsman-friendly federal policy and growth in outdoor industries, future Congresses will take additional steps to not only provide our constituents with greater access to hunting, fishing, shooting, and conservation pursuits, but also help grow jobs in the private sector and support these American traditions.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes. Thank you, sir.
I want to congratulate the gentleman on offering this amendment. I think putting this aspect into this bill, I think will help quantify how important hunting and fishing is if you put an economic component to it. So I congratulate the gentleman, and I plan to support the amendment, and I yield back to the gentleman.
I have reserved the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
I rise to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I believe that the information on the economic impacts of conservation is important. It is something that we don't quantify very well. As we pointed out earlier, some of the provisions of this act, unfortunately, will fly in the face of conservation that benefits hunting and fishing activities on public lands. So I think actually, on balance, the gentleman's requirement here would be very helpful, to help in the future for land managers who have to make decisions between opening up lands to mining or to oil and gas development versus the benefits the community could realize from or has been realizing or will continue to realize from the recreation, hunting, and fishing would be useful information. The federal lands have become essentially a reservoir, a place where these activities are protected for the most part from development, with the exceptions of what I mentioned earlier. And, they are some of the premier destinations for hunting and fishing in the country. And the chairman and I disagree over the merits of acquiring some of these lands, which are, in now private ownership from willing sellers that potentially will otherwise be slated for development, and using Land Water Conservation Fund. I believe that addressing the Land Water Conservation Fund proactively would have been useful. But for certain, given the objections to that, because it has not yet quite expired, even though we're underutilizing it and using the tax dollars somewhere else, the North American Wetlands Conservation Act has expired. Dingell-Whitman amendment was proposed to reauthorize that critical program, and that was not allowed. And so, that would also be something that would show a measurable benefit. With that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
The balance of his time. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I urge my colleagues to support this amendment to qualify and quantify the economic impact of the SHARE Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. Those in favor will say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It's now time to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in House Report 113-339. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 3, printed in House Report number 113-339, offered by Mr. Castro of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to Chairman Hastings and Ranking Member DeFazio for considering this amendment. This amendment concerns the composition of the Hunting Heritage Conservation Council Committee, which will advise the Secretaries of Agriculture and the Interior on policies and programs related to hunting and recreational activities on federal lands. More specifically, the amendment adds a requirement that women and minority hunting and fishing advocacy, outreach, or education organizations are included as discretionary committee members. Examples of such groups include the Women's Hunting and Sporting Foundation, Hispanics Enjoying Camping, Hunting, and Outdoors Organization, and the African American Hunting Organization. This will bring the number of groups in that discretionary committee group to 14 from 12. The groups that I am adding with this amendment were originally included in the committee's charter. This amendment simply codifies their inclusion. I'm proud to offer the amendment to reflect a diverse perspective on America's land use. I yield back my time. I certainly will.
I thank the gentleman for offering this amendment, and I think that his amendment, since the idea of the whole underlying legislation is to expand as much as we can to those that want to enjoy that, I think his amendment adds to the legislation, and I'm prepared to support it, and I thank the gentleman for yielding. Yield back.
Thank you, Chairman, very much.
Would the gentleman yield?
I certainly will, Ranking Member.
I thank the gentleman, and I want to congratulate him on his diligence and his foresight here to propose this amendment. It was an oversight in replacing the current council with a new membership. I'm not exactly certain why we need to do that because we haven't heard particular complaints, but in any case, this is an improvement upon the newly recommended council to include minorities and women fully engaged, since I see a lot of those folks out in the backcountry in my state, and I'm sure you do in Texas too. So I'm pleased for one brief moment here we have a bipartisan consensus. With that, I congratulate the gentleman. Thank you.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, both. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition in opposition? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It's now in order to consider amendment number 4, printed in House Report 113-339. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Are printed in House Report number 113-339, offered by Mr. Gallego of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gallego, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, would like to thank the chairman and the ranking member for their work on this legislation. I can think of nothing more important that all of us, I think, agree on than the importance of taking care of our veterans and our veterans community. Especially now, we have so many wounded warriors coming back, and so many groups that have taken to outdoors activities as part of the therapy for wounded warriors, and making sure that we really approach making them whole again in a very real way. And nature is a huge part of that. Last night, in fact, this chamber held a moment of silence to honor veterans in Afghanistan and Iraq. These are folks who have put their country above all else. And what this amendment specifically would do would be to essentially correct what I believe also was an oversight in ensuring that veterans are also included in this Wildlife Hunting Heritage Conservation Council Advisory Committee. And again, it is because so many veterans groups now and so many places are popping up where the outdoors is a great part of that therapy and a very important part of the therapy that many of our wounded warriors are receiving. And this advisory committee, as they give their advice to the administration, it's important that they do so with the veteran at the table. It's important that veterans have that voice, and they look at it with the perspective from a wounded warrior, a veteran, someone who has served our country in uniform. What is it that we can be doing to make this experience more meaningful for them? And I appreciate, again, the opportunity very much
Would the gentleman yield?
to offer the amendment.
Would the gentleman yield?
Absolutely, I'm happy to yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I want to say that this amendment, I believe, also will add to the underlying legislation, which, of course, to expand the experience of hunting and fishing. And so the remarks I made to his colleague from Texas, I think, is applicable also to this. So I endorse this amendment and tell my friend from Oregon, the ranking member, that's 2 for 2 now, and I'll yield back to the gentleman.
Would the gentleman yield?
Absolutely.
Well, I'd like to. Texas is batting 100 here today. I would like to thank the gentleman for improving the proposed composition of the council. I thought your points about the healing that can come from wounded warriors being in these precious natural areas in our country is very well taken, and I appreciate that. Just not to create any discord at the moment, but there was another amendment that wasn't allowed, and that isn't the purview of the gentleman with the bill on the floor today, but by the Rules Committee that would have, by Representative Weiss, which would have waived recreation fees for veterans with disabilities, and I hope we can revisit that issue in the future. But I congratulate the gentleman on his improvement and his recognition of our veterans.
Thank you very much.
Does the gentleman yield back the balance of his?
I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks opposition? Time in opposition. Seeing none, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Texas. Those in favor will say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It's now in order to consider amendment number 5, printed in House Report 113-339.
As a designee of Mr. Ellison, I have an amendment at the desk. Mr. Ellison is detained at the White House.
It's now in order to consider amendment number 6, printed in House Report 113-339.
Which amendment is he, 5 or 6?
For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
Okay, well, I'm confused. Which one is
number 6?
Okay, because this says number 24. Okay, all right. Now, I would repeat what I said previously. The
gentleman will suspend his.
I have an amendment at the desk
as designee.
As a designee of Mr. Ellison, who's detained at the White House. I ask unanimous consent to proceed with the amendment.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 6, printed in House Report number 113-339, offered by Mr. DeFazio of Oregon.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Oregon.
I want to applaud Congressman Ellison for bringing this amendment to the attention of the House. We have had endless debate about the appropriate role of the National Environmental Policy Act in both Resources Committee and the House Committee on Transportation. The underlying bill, 3590, includes language which would eliminate the need for the Fish and Wildlife Service to disclose, analyze, and take comments on decisions related to management decisions in national wildlife refuges. Let me repeat that. They would not have to analyze or take comments from either side on decisions that relate to management decisions in national wildlife refuges. Never has there been a case made here during the lead up to this bill, such as there was, and during the debate, why we need this very broad NEPA exception, which would, if they wanted to increase hunting, no NEPA analysis. They want to decrease hunting, no NEPA analysis. No opportunity for the public to be involved in the process. And as we learned during the shutdown, the wildlife refuge system provides a tremendous opportunity, some of it very ephemeral in terms of seasons for duck hunters, fishermen, and other sportsmen and women across the country. In some densely populated areas, like in Congressman Thompson's district, wildlife refuges are some of the only hunting areas open to the public, and especially the disabled public. Why do we need to cut the public out, including disabled Americans, veterans, anybody, regarding these special places and their management when no evidence has been presented that NEPA is in any way an impediment to refuge management? It's just the standard boilerplate, repeal NEPA anywhere, everywhere, all the time, and maybe sooner or later it might stick, but it won't, given the veto threat on this bill and the fact that the Senate isn't going to act on it. But anyway, it's in here, and there was an amendment to be offered by Congressman Brown from Georgia, which I was going to strongly support, which would have fixed the bill and probably brought a fair number of votes across the aisle by stripping these extraneous provisions regarding NEPA and wilderness and everything that's under attack in this bill that doesn't need to be under attack in this bill. But I guess somehow, even though it was made in order, the Republican side has convinced him not to offer the amendment because it would have passed and it would have made the bill better. At this point, at least we could support the Ellison amendment as it relates to national wildlife refuges. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition? I'm sorry, from Washington seek recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Well, Mr. Chairman, I guess all good things come to an end because I rise in opposition to the gentleman's amendment. And I oppose this amendment because it undermines what I consider to be a fundamental purpose of the law. The fundamental purpose that we are here today is to protect our hunting and fishing traditions on federal lands. We are making a clear statement that hunting and fishing are important use of our multiple use federal lands. This bill establishes a clear policy that federal lands should be open for hunting and fishing unless specifically closed by a transparent and open federal process. Let me repeat that, Mr. Chairman, that federal lands should be open for hunting and fishing unless specifically closed by a transparent and open federal process. NEPA requires preparation of an environmental impact statement when the federal agency proposes to take major federal action. When H.R. 3590 is enacted into law, there will be no need for a costly and bureaucratic process currently necessary to make lands available for hunting and fishing. That process won't be necessary because it will be the law. Congress has spoken as to what the law is. Again, this bill is designed to set out an open, unless specifically closed process on BLM and Forest Service lands. As a result, no major federal action would be needed or would take place to keep these lands open to these traditional important uses of our shared federal lands. And if there is no administrative action, there is no need for an EIS or NEPA review. However, H.R. 3590 conforms an established understanding of the law that should an agency move to close federal lands, the agency should then undertake an open and public process before having the lands closed to our traditional uses. Now, we know that these provisions are important because they fix a court-created problem regarding the implementation of the 1997 National Wildlife Refuge System Improvement Act. We have seen the clear track record that anti-hunter groups will use to tie up hunting and fishing access to federal lands with endless lawsuits. This bill reverses this trend and makes our lands open for hunting and fishing. Again, Mr. Chairman, we are making a policy statement that this will be what the law of the land is. H.R. 3590 directs that our conservation dollars be spent on conservation activities in the field rather than on redundant paperwork and, of course, endless lawsuits. That is the goal of the bill that this amendment would undercut, and which would undercut our goal of promoting hunting and fishing. And I urge the defeat of the amendment, and I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves his time.
I yield back.
The gentleman from Oregon yields back. The gentleman from Washington.
I urge defeat of the amendment, and I yield back my time.
Question on the amendment is offered by the gentleman from Oregon. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Who has it? In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Oregon will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 7, printed in the House Report 113-339. For what purpose does the gentleman from Missouri seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 7, printed in House Report Number 113-339, offered by Mr. Smith of Missouri.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, and a member opposing each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for my opportunity to present this amendment to H.R. 3590 today, the Sportsman Heritage and Recreational Enhancement Act. As a member of the Natural Resources Committee, I couldn't be prouder of the work that we have done to continue to protect our sportsmen's ability to enjoy the outdoors. As such, I'm honored to offer my amendment that would ensure that sportsmen will continue to be able to use motorized vessels in the Ozark National Scenic Riverways, a national park contained wholly within my congressional district in southern Missouri. The Ozark National Scenic Riverways is a popular destination in Missouri for fishing, gigging, and trapping. These activities have traditionally been undertaken by individuals and families for generations. An economy has arisen in my district, selling boats and motors and other products to folks who want to gig, fish, and trap within the rivers. Recently, the National Park Service has been discussing closing down areas of the park to motorized vessels and further limiting the horsepower of these vessels in other areas. The reduction of boat motor horsepower would limit the number of folks who could be on a boat and restrict access to families. Banning motorized vessels from areas of the park where they are currently allowed would further restrict the public's use and enjoyment of the park. Banning motorized vessels would also exclude groups from using the river that simply have no other options, like the elderly and disabled veterans. Why would the Park Service resort to such drastic measures to block activities that are currently allowed? One explanation is that they don't want folks to be able to utilize the river like they have for the past decades. My amendment would simply preserve the current park regulations as they are now and how they've been for the last 5 decades, preventing the Park Service from regulating sportsmen off the river. The Ozark National Scenic Riverways was created for the enjoyment of the public, and it should stay with the public.
Would the gentleman yield?
I do.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. And Mr. Chairman, I just want to say that I think this amendment is in the spirit of the underlying legislation, which is to make sure that there is access for hunting and fishing. And here we have, as I said in my opening statement, the potential of bureaucratic malaise, I guess, slowing down access to this particular area that the gentleman from Missouri represents. I think his amendment adds a great deal to this legislation, and I intend to support it, and I yield back to the gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you. Thank you.
I reserve your time.
I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
I rise in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
I certainly am not an expert on the gentleman's district and what the exact issue is here. However, I do know that there has been a proposed management plan that's been out for comment since November 8th. It'll close on Friday. I would hope that the gentleman and concerned parties on either side of the issue have all weighed in to comment, because what we're doing here today, this bill will not become law. It's already guaranteed a veto threat. The addition of this to the bill will not help resolve what is a local issue where the Park Service has to weigh comments from motorized users and non-motorized users, and then come to a conclusion, weighing those comments and put forward a new management plan. That's the way this is going to get done. Shouldn't be done from Washington, D.C., shouldn't be dictating. If we get into every individual land use or access decision being made by every unit of the Park Service, every unit of our, of the Fish and Wildlife Service and their refuges, and every unit of the Forest Service and every unit of the BLM, we're going to be pretty busy and be embroiled in a lot of local controversy. This, I believe, is it's premature in that comment closes this week, and the process will come to a conclusion. Comments will be weighed, and a decision will be put out for final comment. And it's also, at this point, being added to a bill that's going nowhere. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield to yes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I just want to clarify something, Mr. Chairman, has been said here by my friend, the ranking member, that the administration has issued a veto threat. They have not issued a veto threat. They have said, and I'll just read the last line of their statement of administration policy. It says, the administration looks forward to working with Congress to enact sportsman and recreation legislation that addresses the concerns raised with certain provisions of H.R. 3590. Now, in the letter, they do say they have problems with 4 of the 8 titles, but to simply suggest that the administration has issued a veto threat on this is simply not correct. And I ask I'll let it go, and I yield back to the gentleman.
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized.
I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Missouri. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 8, printed in House Report 1113-339. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arkansas seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 8, printed in House Report Number 113-339, offered by Mr. Crawford of Arkansas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Crawford, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas.
Thank you. I yield myself such time as I may consume. My amendment will provide a limited exemption related to the taking of migratory game birds over farm fields. In short, it clarifies a recent interpretation by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service about what constitutes a baited field. In 2012, the agency warned rice growers that some of their fields that had been rolled, as farmers often do after the harvest to prepare the field to be planted the next spring, could be off limits to waterfowl hunting. That summer's drought led to an early rice harvest in several parts of the country, and heavy rainfall then caused a rare secondary ratoon crop to sprout. The Fish and Wildlife Service cautioned that should rice heads emerge in those fields, their guidelines stated that in any field work such as rolling would make it a baited field where waterfowl hunting would be unlawful. Waterfowl hunting is a vital industry in my state. Hunters come from the world over to Arkansas's 1st District, and farmers, small businesses, and the rural communities that dot the Delta all rely on the millions of dollars hunters bring with them every year. My amendment is a common sense solution that simply states that a field may not be considered baited as the result of normal agricultural practices, as determined by the State Office of the Cooperative Extension Service at the request of the Secretary of Interior, with concurrence from that state's Fish and Wildlife Service. I ask for your support for this important amendment that will protect farmers from being punished for simply carrying out long-recognized and responsible agricultural practices. With that, I recognize the chairman.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I plan to support his amendment. But this is something that seems like we wrestle with all the time here on the federal level. There's uniqueness when you're on the ground, but yet we write rules and regulations of a one-size-fits-all. This is clearly a unique situation, and I think the gentleman's amendment clarifies that very well. And I support the amendment, and I yield back to the gentleman.
Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
To oppose the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
We often have conflicts. In Oregon, we had a very substantial conflict relating to geese and in terms of farmers' fields. And the resolution was that the birds protected by the Migratory Bird Act would continue to be protected, but farmers would be able to hunt with the state license, and I don't know about the gentleman's state whether or not state license would be required, the birds that were not migratory, that were becoming pests and were resident in order to protect their crops. And this substantially resolved the problem. I don't know if a similar, fix would work here, but an amendment that gives, an open license on the Migratory Bird Act, which has international implications, the Migratory Bird Treaty, seems to me to be an extreme measure in this case. And therefore, we would oppose the amendment. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time.
I reserve.
The from Arkansas is recognized. The gentleman yields back.
Did you want to say anything?
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arkansas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 9, printed in House Report 113-339. For what purpose does the gentleman from Louisiana seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 9, printed in House Report Number 113-339, offered by Mr. Fleming of Louisiana.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Fleming, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I yield myself as much time as I may consume. My amendment today maintains the state of Louisiana's ability to regulate hunting within its borders. In a decision announced March 1st, 2012, the Forest Service Regional Forester, located way over in Atlanta, Georgia, went over the heads of the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries and the Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries Commission to forever prohibit the use of dogs to hunt deer in Kisatchie National Forest. Deer hunting has a long and important cultural history within the state of Louisiana. When French settlers first came to Louisiana in the 18th century, thickets and dense timber covered the area. Most of these settlers had companion dogs with them, and the most treasured companions were the deer hounds. The use of dogs helped hunters drive the deer from the woods onto trails, and the plentiful herds provided exciting sport and sound nourishment. The 600,000-acre Kisatchie National Forest has provided diverse hunting opportunities for decades, including the use of dogs in hunting a variety of animals. Oddly enough, the regional forester does not prohibit the use of dogs for hunting raccoon, squirrel, rabbit, and game birds. The dog deer season in Louisiana has been severely restricted in recent years, down from 15 days to 7 days in 2012. And dog deer hunting in the Kisatchie has been limited to certain ranger districts. According to communication with the Forest Service, even southern states allow hunting in the 7 southern states allow hunting in the national forest within their borders. They include Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Louisiana. However, this is the first time the Forest Service has issued a ban on dog deer hunting or hunting deer with dogs within a specific state. According to the Forest Service documents, the revenue generated from dog deer hunting, including the care of animals, contributes approximately 18 to 29 direct jobs and results in roughly $890,000 to $1.4 million of income from hunting tourism and related activities. by the Forest Service's own assessment, it is likely that economic benefits are currently being lost as hunters leave the area to pursue the sport elsewhere. This is having a tangible economic impact on our state, robbing it of even more jobs. I would like to emphasize that the state of Louisiana, the Kennel Club, and Safari Club International support my amendment, and a similar amendment was accepted by the House with a voice vote last Congress. I urge support of this amendment, and I reserve. Yes, sir.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I think this is a good amendment, and I do support the amendment. The primary purpose of this legislation is to limit unjustified federal bureaucratic limitations on hunting and fishing. And I also want to make a point here also. It's important to recognize that the authority of states to regulate hunting and fishing should be paramount over the federal government. Individual federal agencies should not preempt state laws. It sounds to me like that's what the gentleman is talking about in his case. I think the amendment is a good amendment. I support it, and I yield back to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon seek recognition?
I rise to speak in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
We've talked about major problems confronting this Congress, and here we are now trying to resolve yet another local conflict. After considerable complaints by private property owners about hunters encroaching on their land to retrieve their dogs who'd gotten lost, driving on their land and that, the Forest Service decided, because of the intermingled ownership, to prohibit the dog deer hunting. Now come the gentleman who says, well, we're going to reopen it. We will countermand the locally made decision, but we will have a new process where the private landowners can petition the secretary to reclose certain areas of the area that are now closed that he's reopening because of conflicts with their private property. However, these private property owners' petitions will have to go through the dreaded NEPA process, and that is, for deciding something as minor as that, kind of problematic. I guess that maybe we should have a special day here where, and I got some beefs with some federal agencies ongoing that I'd like to settle with legislation too. Maybe we should just have an open amendment process someday where every little local issue we've been dealing with a federal agency, which is contentious between conflicting users, will be decided by the United States Congress in Washington, D.C., not at the local level. That's what we're doing here. It's pretty extraordinary. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to address issues brought up here. First of all, the gentleman said that there were multiple complaints, and this was studied considerably. There was 1,237 responses to a request in 2009, and by October 6th, we found that there were 77%, a clear majority of the respondents who were actually in favor of continuing the practice of dog deer hunting. This was requested again in 2011. There were over 1,300 respondents, and all but 16 comments were in favor of dog deer hunting and against the Forest Service proposed ban. The other thing I'd like to address, Mr. Chairman, is this was not a locally made decision. This was made in Atlanta. Okay, this is the problem. This has been going on for 300 years in the state of Louisiana. It's a big part of our heritage, and somebody over in Georgia, in Atlanta, representing the federal government, made this decision, not locally. There was no decision locally. The state supports this. The local residents support it by a vast majority, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
I would yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And in closing, I'd like to just say again, the people of Louisiana want to see this Forest Service ban overturned. This was a decision made outside of our borders. In effect, if you will, even though the people of Louisiana were asked and they gave the correct answer, it was ignored in the decision made by someone outside of our borders. This was a decision made by somebody, again, in Atlanta, a federal employee interfering with a local issue. This is a tradition that goes back, again, 300 years, and I think it's pretty obvious that the people of Louisiana support the continuance of hunting deer with dogs. I yield back the balance of my time. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. The committee will rise informally to receive a message.
The House will be in order. The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate agreed to the report of the Committee of Conference to H.R. 2642, cited as the Federal Agricultural Reform and Risk Management Act of 2013.
The committee will resume its sitting.
It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 10, printed in the House Report 113-339. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 10, printed in House Report Number 113-339, offered by Mr. Holt of New Jersey.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Holt, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chairman recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
I thank the chairman. Sportsmen are among the first to notice the effects of our changing climate. As changes in seasonal distribution of game and diminished natural habitats become more evident. As the climate continues to change, we will experience worse drought, flood, wildfire, and extreme weather events. For public lands and recreation there, climate change will mean changes in hunting seasons, migratory patterns, the native and invasive species populations. We will experience sea level rise, wildfire, drought, and other manifestations of climate change. All of these are altering the landscape and changing the existing opportunities for hunting, fishing, and recreation on public lands. These should be considered. These will have a greater effect on sportsmen, on fishers and hunters than all of the other things we've been talking about today. More than 75% of the federal lands are open now for recreational hunting, fishing, and shooting, but climate change would transform irreversibly, in fact, is transforming irreversibly our public lands in ways that will limit the ability of sportsmen to enjoy the recreational activities in these areas. So this amendment says the department should consider those things. In fact, it's even more limited than that. It says nothing will prevent the department from considering these things. That's what this amendment is. I would hope that the House will accept this. I've been joined by a number of members of the House Sustainable and Energy Coalition in offering this amendment. It is supported by Defenders of Wildlife and the Wilderness Society and the Sierra Club and the Natural Resources Defense Council. I reserve the balance of my time.
Reserves. Purpose, does the gentleman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized.
I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Mr. Chairman, the primary purpose of this underlying legislation is the premise that federal lands should be open for hunting and fishing recreation rather than being closed. I believe this should be the policy of all of our multiple use federal lands. The default option should be open regardless of whether your interests are mountain biking, rock climbing, hunting, fishing, logging, building a solar energy facility, mining, wind power, or developing oil gas. Our nation's multiple-use lands were designed to be used for the benefit of the nation. This open before closed concept is the foundation of what we are trying to do through this legislation. We are trying to raise the bar of bureaucracy that the bureaucracy has placed between hunters and the outdoors. Reckless disregard of our nation's hunting and fishing traditions means too often our federal lands are closed off arbitrarily and not just without public input, but against the public sentiment. Now the gentleman is proposing that we give the Secretary another new tool to close lands without scientific decision-making, without accounting for their actions. The gentleman proposes that we simply grant the Secretary the sole authority to dictate that we close off any and all of our nation's lands from hunting and fishing based simply on the Secretary's mere opinion that hunting and fishing are a threat to our nation's land because of climate change. Hunting and fishing are traditions and foundations that this nation was built upon. They are not burdens to our national lands. They are one of the many purposes for our national lands. Now, just yesterday, Mr. Chairman, before the Rules Committee, one of my Democrat colleagues was commenting that he had a BB gun at age 7, a .22 rifle at age 12. He talked about how, as a young man, he learned to respect guns and traditions. Yet that same member is concerned about what children are learning today and the lack of respect for guns and the traditions of the outdoors. Mr. Chairman, I believe that this is one of the many benefits and reasons that we are here today to help restore the opportunity for hunting and fishing traditions to take root in our federal lands. To remind our federal land managers that the exercise of these traditions are not a burden on our lands, but one of the foundations of our lands. Finally, let me say this. Regardless of one's view on our climate, this amendment is not about climate change. It's about granting the Secretary a blank check to ban hunting and fishing. Nothing in the bill changes the Secretary's ability to manage our lands to ensure responsible management. The bill does require lands to be open, however, before closed, but when closing lands, the Secretary must act in a measured fashion to ensure that our hunting and fishing traditions are protected and valued. So I urge my colleagues to reject what I consider to be an anti-hunting and fishing amendment, and I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
May I ask the time remaining on each side?
From New Jersey has 3 minutes. The gentleman from Washington has 1.5 minutes.
I thank the chair. And I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman who represents Northern Virginia, who, as a leader of the Sustainable Energy and Environment Caucus, is a co-sponsor of this amendment.
The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chair and I thank my colleague. As the co-chair of the Green Dogs of the Sikh Caucus, I rise in support of this amendment and proud to co-sponsor it. The bill before us purports to be about expanding opportunities for sportsmen on federal lands, yet it fails to recognize the significant effect climate change will have on such opportunities. For example, what will climate change mean for hunters who are forced away from parks because of drought or threat of wildfire? As we witnessed this year, wildfire seasons are now longer, larger, and longer term than ever before because of climate change. The migratory patterns of ducks, and for that matter, the patterns of fish, to name just 2 species, are also being negatively affected. What will climate change mean for anglers who find streams drying up and killing fish? Last September, Montana officials closed the Blackfoot River. Not the Secretary. They did. The iconic backdrop for the book and film, A River Runs Through It, to protect fish from the stress of low-level river flows. Mr. Chairman, if we really want to protect and expand outdoor recreational opportunities, shouldn't we understand what climate change will mean not only for hunters, but for the affected wildlife and their habitat? I urge my colleagues to support this simple, common-sense amendment, and I yield back to my friend from New Jersey.
The gentleman yields back.
I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from
I
Washington.
reserve my time, and I advise my friend I have no request for time, and I'm prepared to yield back. The gentleman is prepared to yield back.
I will claim the remaining time just to address a couple of points that my friend, the chair from Washington, has raised. There is nothing in this amendment that gives the Secretary any new authority. It simply says that the Secretary should consider climate change in policies for managing these lands. Climate change is the problem that needs to be addressed. You can deny it all you want, but climate change will do more to restrict hunting and fishing and recreation on public lands than these imagined administrative reductions or restrictions or lawsuits or restrictions on lead shot or any of those things. There are a variety of adaptation strategies to promote resilience of fish and wildlife populations and forests and plant communities and freshwater resources and ocean resources. These are being studied by academic and scientific and, yes, government and nonprofit organizations. A great deal of thought is going into this, and we want to make sure that there is nothing that restricts the Secretary from using these best adaptation strategies, these best management practices, to take into account what is real. It is not imagined. The climate is changing. It is affecting the ecology of all of these public lands. I urge support of this amendment.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I yield myself the balance of the time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to point out that the gentleman wanted to clarify by saying this doesn't give authority, but the Secretary should consider. But what if the Secretary considers under current law and then decides to take action? That is the point of the argument that I made. And that is that that action then on climate change could cause limited or no access to our public lands. That's why I said this amendment is kind of cloaked in different clothing, because it does not speak to climate change. In fact, it speaks to the potential closing of our public lands. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on the amendment, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, on that I ask a recorded vote.
What do you say? Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey will be postponed. It is now in order to consider the amendment number 11 printed in House Report 113-339.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to act as a designee of Mr. Kildee, and I have an amendment in the rule under the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 11, printed in House Report number 113-339, offered by Mr. Polis of Colorado.
Pursuant to House Resolution 470, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 1972, President Nixon signed Executive Order 11644, which required that the U.S. Forest Service create travel management plans for the operation of off-road vehicles in our national forests, including snowmobiles. These travel management plans were designed to address the concerns of different users. They can be simple or detailed enough to affect noise, carbon emissions, traffic patterns, protect animal migratory patterns. In 2005, the Forest Service finalized its travel management rules for off-road vehicles in the National Forest System, except for snowmobiles, which were granted an exemption. Each year, outdoor enthusiasts contribute enormous amounts to our economy, and snowmobile supports thousands of jobs, not only in my district, but across the country. Not only do many of our residents enjoy snowmobiling, but it attracts significant tourism to areas like Eagle and Summit and Grand County, and actually creates jobs in our areas. Although snowmobiles were exempted from this rule, individual forest managers were still able to restrict snowmobile travel as appropriate on a case-by-case basis through individual travel management plans which met the unique needs of each area. In 2013, however, a federal district court in Idaho in the Winter Wildlands Alliance versus Forest Service case ruled the Forest Service must develop an overarching travel management rule that includes snowmobiles to comply with President Nixon's original executive order. This amendment states that while the National Forest Service develops this travel management plan, it's the sense of Congress that the Forest Service should continue to allow snowmobiles on federal lands during this rule's development with the same restrictions that were in place prior to the Winter Wildlands Alliance decision to ensure that the ability of snowmobilers to recreate is not interfered with because of this period where we are developing our permanent policy. Given the breadth of outdoor activities, it makes simple sense that public land should be available for multiple uses, including snowmobiling. About a quarter of Americans who participate in outdoor recreation enjoy motorized vehicles as part of that activity. And like other outdoor enthusiasts, snowmobilers contribute to communities by renting equipment, staying in hotels, purchasing souvenirs, enjoying local restaurants, and more. And as off-road vehicle use expands, it becomes increasingly important for the U.S. Forest Service to issue its rules to determine whether areas are open or closed to snowmobiles. This sense of Congress will allow that certainty that will allow our tourism industry to continue and our residents to continue to enjoy snowmobiling.
Would the gentleman yield?
I reserve the balance of my...
Would the gentleman yield?
I'll be happy to yield. I'd be happy to yield, yes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I say on a personal note, I was looking for you on the floor at the end of last week, and I was prepared to take Seattle and offer you 34 points, and I think you probably would have taken that bet. But I just want to make this point. If the gentleman will say that the results of on the gridiron in New Jersey last Sunday, if the gentleman will say that the better team won, and you don't have to make any other adjectives, but if the gentleman will say that, I will be more than happy to accept this amendment.
I will be happy to say on the record that the better team on that particular day won. There's still some doubt about whether that was in fact the Denver Broncos that took the field.
Well, I knew that the gentleman would find something to say, but I just want to say, as dealing with the amendment, I think this amendment, again, in the spirit of adding more activity on federal lands, I think this adds to it, and I'm prepared to support the amendment. And I yield back to the gentleman and thank him for it.
I thank the chair, and I yield to the ranking member, Mr. DeFazio.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I congratulate Mr. Polis and Congressman Kildee, who is detained at the White House, for offering this amendment. I appreciate that the majority has accepted it. This will be a temporary provision until such a time as the final rule is adopted. There was never I don't think any intent to have this sort of a blanket ban on snowmobiles, and this would correct that error by the Forest Service as they go through a deliberative process on where, when, and how snowmobiles will access federal forest lands on a unit-by-unit basis. So I thank the gentleman.
And I thank the gentleman from Washington for his remarks. You know that when the defense of one team scores more points than the offense of the other team, you know your team's not in good shape. But I congratulate the gentleman. 12 seconds, fastest ever score in a way that was quite embarrassing for the Broncos. But we'll be back next year. We look forward to challenging in the NFL. I appreciate the support from both the chair and the ranking member for Mr. Kildee's and my amendment. This rule will help the U.S. Forest Service improve management, prevent the disruption of the tourism industry, allow for the continued enjoyment of residents in snowmobiling, and ensure that off-road vehicles are used in a manner that protects natural resources, minimizes conflict with other users, and provides and protects motorized recreation. Until we finalize the travel plan, snowmobilers will be able to, under this sense of Congress, enjoy their favorite activity, and communities should continue to reap the economic benefits of hosting these winter sports enthusiasts. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. Does anyone seek time in opposition? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman?
The gentleman from Washington is recognized.
I move the committee to now rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.
Very good, guys. Thank you. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the House and State of the Union has considered H.R. 3590 directs me to report that there is no resolution.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has under consideration H.R. 3590 and has come to no resolution thereon.